There is a moment, in the early hours of any great catastrophe, when the world still looks perfectly ordinary. Birds still sing, rivers still run. The air holds the particular stillness of a summer night not yet surrendered to morning. And somewhere along a border that stretches for nearly 2,000 kilometers, more than 3 million men wait in the dark, holding their breath, for a signal that will change the course of human history forever. That signal came at 0400 hours on the 22nd of June 1941. In the space of a single morning, the largest military invasion in the history of warfare was set into motion. Not a border skirmish, not a limited offensive. A total, consuming assault across an entire continent. Artillery, aircraft, armor, and infantry moving in coordinated waves against a nation that, at least on paper, had every reason to see it coming, and somehow, catastrophically, did not. What followed would last nearly 4 years. It would consume somewhere between 25 and 27 million Soviet lives. It would drain Germany of a generation of soldiers, pilots, and engineers. It would reduce cities to ash, transform farmland into graveyards, and rewrite the political map of the entire world. And it would begin, as so many of history's greatest disasters do, with a single man utterly convinced of his own brilliance, and utterly wrong about almost everything that mattered. His name needs no introduction, but his decision does. Because Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign, it was the physical expression of an ideology, a belief system so warped by racial fantasy and historical grievance that it transformed abstract hatred into operational orders, into fuel allocations, into timetables for conquest that assumed a vast and ancient nation would simply collapse within 10 weeks. The men who designed it were not fools. Many of them were among the finest military minds their country had ever produced, and yet they built a plan on a foundation of contempt. Contempt for the enemy, contempt for distance, contempt for winter, and contempt for the possibility that they might be wrong. That contempt would cost them everything. This is the complete history of Operation Barbarossa, and it is not a simple story. It is not simply the story of German aggression, though aggression there was, on a scale the world had rarely witnessed. It is not simply the story of Soviet heroism, though courage was displayed, often in conditions so extreme they barely seem survivable. It is the story of how two of the most powerful and most brutal regimes in modern history collided on a front so vast, so violent, and so unrelenting that it makes almost every other theatre of the Second World War look, by comparison, like a limited engagement. The Eastern Front was the war. Everything else orbited around it. It is also a story about the gap between belief and reality, about what happens when a leader mistakes his own certainty for strategic truth. Hitler did not stumble into Barbarossa. He walked toward it deliberately, purposefully, over the course of more than a decade, driven by a vision of Eastern Europe as empty living space waiting to be seized, and a vision of the Soviet state as a rotten structure that would collapse at the first serious blow. He was wrong on both counts, profoundly, fatally wrong, and by the time the evidence of that wrongness was undeniable, hundreds of thousands of men on both sides had already paid for his miscalculation with their lives. What makes this history worth sitting with, worth really examining in detail, is not the scale of the battles, though the scale is genuinely staggering. It is the accumulation of decisions, assumptions, and missed warnings that led a modern military power to design a campaign it could not actually complete. It is the way that certainty, at every level of the German command structure, functioned as a kind of blindness, preventing the men who ran the invasion from seeing what the evidence around them was already making clear. And it is the way the Soviet Union, written off as militarily incompetent and ideologically hollow, refused to die on the schedule Germany had prepared for it, and instead absorbed a blow that would have shattered almost any other state, and then, slowly and at tremendous cost, began to fight back. That reversal, from catastrophic collapse to eventual strategic dominance, is one of the most dramatic turning points in modern history, and it did not happen cleanly or quickly. It happened through attrition, through sacrifice, through the replacement of officers who did not know how to fight with officers who were learning, through the relocation of entire industries east of the Ural Mountains, through the stubborn, grinding insistence of a people under occupation that they had not yet been defeated. The Soviet Union in 1941 was, by any external measure, on the edge of collapse. The fact that it did not collapse is almost as remarkable as the invasion itself. Over the course of what follows, we are going to walk through every stage of this campaign, from the ideological roots that made Barbarossa feel, to Hitler, not merely desirable but necessary, through the cynical diplomacy of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which bought Germany time while buying Stalin a dangerous and ultimately costly sense of security, through the extraordinary secrecy of German planning, the catastrophic Soviet unpreparedness, and the opening hours of the invasion itself, hours in which Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground by the hundreds. Soviet commanders struggled to reach their superiors on phones that had gone silent, and entire divisions were surrounded before they could form a coherent defensive line. We will follow the great encirclements of the summer months, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, in which German armor moved faster than Soviet commanders could respond, and the numbers of prisoners taken stretched the limits of what the human mind could easily process. We will sit with the moment in autumn 1941, when German officers began, quietly, to look at their maps and their fuel gauges and their casualty reports and feel, for the first time, something that resembled genuine doubt. We will stand before Moscow in December of that year, in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, with troops wearing summer uniforms and vehicles that would not start, and ask the question that so many German soldiers were asking themselves: how did we get here? And then we will follow the long, brutal, grinding retreat, through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through the slow westward collapse that ended with Soviet armies on German soil and a city in ruins, and a man in a bunker who had gambled his nation's future on a theory of racial superiority and lost absolutely everything. If you have come here to sleep, and there is no shame in that, this is exactly the kind of story that rewards a long, unhurried listen. Then settle in, find your position, let the weight of the day begin to lift. This is going to be a long journey, and it is going to take us to places that are sometimes difficult, sometimes astonishing, and occasionally, quietly, deeply human. War at this scale becomes abstract very quickly. The numbers are too large. The geography is too vast. What we will try to do, throughout, is bring it back to the scale of individual decisions, individual moments, individual men and women caught inside something far larger than themselves. If you are watching this for the first time and you find it worth your while, the best thing you can do is subscribe and stay close. There is a great deal more history to explore, and it deserves to be explored properly, with care, with accuracy, and with the kind of quiet attention that a story this significant has always deserved. Because what happened on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945 did not stay on the Eastern Front. It echoed outward through decades. It drew the borders of a divided Europe, It set the terms of the Cold War. It shaped the world that every person alive today was born into. It all began in the dark, in the silence before dawn, on the 22nd of June 1941. And it began with a gamble. There is a particular kind of obsession that does not announce itself loudly. It settles quietly into the architecture of a man's thinking, brick by brick, until it becomes the walls of every room he inhabits. For Adolf Hitler, the vast plains of the Soviet Union were never simply a foreign country. They were, in his mind, a destiny, a space waiting to be claimed, a civilization waiting to be erased, and a racial enemy waiting to be destroyed. Long before a single German soldier crossed the Soviet frontier, the invasion existed in Hitler's imagination as something close to a biological imperative. To understand Operation Barbarossa, you must first understand the man who conceived it, not as a rational actor making cold strategic calculations, but as an ideologue so consumed by a fixed idea that he bent the entire apparatus of a modern state to serve it. Hitler's concept of Lebensraum, living space, was not original to him. German thinkers and geographers had been writing about Eastern expansion for decades before the First World War, imagining a German-dominated agricultural empire stretching into the Slavic heartland. But Hitler absorbed this idea and transformed it into something far more violent and personal. In the pages of his political manifesto, written during his imprisonment in the mid-1920s, he laid out his vision with startling candor. Germany's future, he argued, lay not in colonial ambitions overseas, but in conquest on the European continent itself, specifically in the East, at the expense of Russia. The Slavic peoples he regarded not as political opponents to be negotiated with, but as racially inferior populations to be displaced or subjugated, their lands repopulated by German settlers who would feed the Reich's growing population. What he wrote in those prison years was not idle fantasy. It was a blueprint, and he would spend the next 2 decades building the machinery to execute it. Intertwined with the Lebensraum obsession was Hitler's pathological hatred of Bolshevism. In his worldview, the two were inseparable. Soviet communism was not merely a competing political ideology. It was, in his telling, the political expression of a Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world. This fusion of anti-Semitism and anti-communism into a single apocalyptic enemy gave his hatred an almost religious intensity. The Soviet Union was not simply a state to be defeated. It was a manifestation of everything he believed threatened the survival of what he called the Aryan race. Destroying it was therefore not war in any conventional sense. It was, in his own mind, a cleansing act, an existential struggle that justified any method, any atrocity, any sacrifice. This ideological framing would have catastrophic consequences for how the eventual invasion was planned and conducted, elevating racial hatred above military prudence at every turn. Through the early and mid-1930s, as Hitler consolidated power inside Germany, this obsession remained largely theoretical. The Wehrmacht was still being rebuilt from the ruins of Versailles restrictions. Germany lacked the military strength to challenge the Soviet Union directly, and Hitler was shrewd enough to know it. So he bided his time, remilitarizing the Rhineland, absorbing Austria, dismembering Czechoslovakia through diplomatic coercion, and watching anxiously to see how the Western democracies would respond. Their repeated failures to confront him only deepened his conviction that his judgment was superior to that of the professional diplomats and generals who surrounded him. Every gamble that succeeded, and in those years they all did, added another layer of certainty to the idea that he alone understood what was historically possible and what was historically necessary. The economic pressures bearing down on Germany by the late 1930s were equally significant in shaping his thinking. The rapid rearmament program that had rebuilt German military power had also strained the German economy to a dangerous degree. Germany was critically short of oil, short of iron ore, short of rubber, and short of food. The Nazi economic model was in many ways built on borrowed time. It could sustain a short, victorious war, but a prolonged conflict against resourceful enemies would expose structural weaknesses that Hitler's propaganda could not paper over. The Soviet Union, in his mind, was the answer to every one of these shortages. The Ukrainian grain fields could feed Germany's cities. The Caucasian oil wells could fuel Germany's tanks and aircraft. The mineral wealth of the Urals could supply Germany's factories for generations. Conquest was not simply ideologically desirable. From Hitler's perspective, it was economically indispensable. The invasion, when it came, was partly a war of ideas and partly a war of hunger. The fall of France in the summer of 1940 accelerated everything. When German armoured columns bypassed the Maginot Line and drove the British Expeditionary Force to the Channel coast at Dunkirk, when France, the France that had humiliated Germany in the First World War, capitulated in roughly 6 weeks, Hitler experienced something that would prove far more dangerous than defeat. He experienced what felt like total vindication. His generals had been cautious, had urged restraint, had warned of catastrophe. He had overruled them, and France had collapsed. In the euphoria that followed, a man already inclined toward grandiose self-belief became something else entirely, a figure who had begun to genuinely mistake his own obsessions for strategic insight. He was no longer simply an ideologue with an army. He was, in his own estimation, a military genius whose vision transcended the conventional wisdom of the general staff. It was in this atmosphere of inflated confidence that the formal planning for what would become Barbarossa began to take shape. Hitler had not abandoned the idea of crossing the English Channel. Negotiations for a potential landing in Britain consumed German military planners through much of the summer of 1940. But alongside those deliberations, the idea of turning east began to crystallize into operational intent. In a series of meetings with his senior military commanders in the second half of 1940, Hitler outlined his conviction that destroying the Soviet Union quickly was not a distraction from the war against Britain, but actually the solution to it. Without a powerful ally on the continent, he argued, Britain would have no rational basis for continued resistance and would eventually seek terms. The logic was seductive, at least to those who shared his fundamental assumptions. Those who doubted him had learned, after France, that expressing doubt was a precarious business. Hitler's assessment of Soviet military capability was catastrophically distorted. He had watched the Red Army's performance in the Winter War against Finland, which had begun in the closing months of 1939 and ended in the spring of 1940. The Soviets, despite their enormous numerical superiority, had stumbled badly against a smaller Finnish army, suffering staggering casualties before finally overwhelming Finnish defences through sheer weight of numbers. For Hitler, this was confirmation of everything he believed about Bolshevik military incompetence. He did not adequately consider that the Red Army's poor showing reflected specific problems of doctrine, communication, and officer preparation that the Soviets were actively working to correct. He saw what he wanted to see, a giant with feet of clay, waiting to be toppled. One hard push, he told his commanders, and the whole rotten structure would collapse. The German military planners who were tasked with translating Hitler's vision into an operational concept struggled from the beginning with the sheer scale of what was being proposed. The Soviet Union was not France. It was not a compact Western European nation with a dense road and rail network and a navigable frontier. It was a continent disguised as a country, stretching across 11 time zones, with infrastructure that thinned to near nothing as you moved east. The distances involved were staggering. From the western frontier to Moscow was roughly 1,000 kilometers, and Moscow was not even the eastern limit of what the plan eventually envisaged. German logistics officers who ran the numbers came back with deeply uncomfortable findings. The Wehrmacht's supply system, built for the campaigns in Poland and France, was not remotely adequate for a sustained offensive across such distances. These concerns were noted, partially addressed, and ultimately overridden by the weight of Hitler's certainty. What emerged from the planning process was a campaign built on a single, critical assumption: that the Soviet state was so politically brittle, so economically backward, and so militarily incompetent that it would effectively destroy itself once struck with sufficient force. Germany did not need to conquer all of Russia. It needed only to shatter the Soviet military in the western regions, capture enough territory to deprive the Soviet state of its industrial and agricultural heartland, and wait for the political structure to implode under the strain. It was, at its core, a theory of psychological collapse, dressed up as a military campaign. The Wehrmacht would advance so rapidly and destroy so many Soviet formations that the Soviet leadership, whether through surrender, internal revolt, or simple exhaustion, would be unable to continue organized resistance. The war would be over, Hitler predicted, in a matter of weeks. His generals, many of them privately unconvinced, said little to contradict him. By the time winter turned to spring in 1941, the planning had progressed from concept to detailed operational order. The attack would be executed across 3 enormous axes of advance: one aimed at Leningrad in the north, one driving toward Moscow in the center, and one sweeping through Ukraine toward Kiev and the agricultural and industrial wealth of the south. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers would be committed to the assault, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft in numbers the world had never witnessed in a single offensive operation. The border regions had been quietly surveilled, the Luftwaffe had conducted reconnaissance overflights, and logistics dumps were being assembled with careful attention to secrecy. A civilization was preparing to hurl itself against another civilization, and the man responsible believed, with complete conviction, that it would be settled before the autumn leaves fell. What Hitler could not account for, what his ideology actively prevented him from accounting for, was the possibility that the people he regarded as racially inferior might prove more resilient, more determined, and ultimately more capable than his theories allowed. His obsession had been the engine that drove Barbarossa from the fever dream of a prison manuscript to the largest land invasion in recorded history. That same obsession had stripped him of the ability to see clearly what he was actually proposing to destroy. Not a rotten structure waiting to collapse, but a nation of hundreds of millions of people. People who, when their soil was burned and their cities besieged, would find within themselves a capacity for endurance that no German General Staff appreciation had measured, and that no Nazi racial theory had predicted. The architect had drawn his plans. The construction was about to begin, and the foundation he was building on was not stone. In the summer of 1939, the capitals of Europe watched the 2 great ideological enemies of the age circle each other with what appeared to be mutual contempt. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had spent the better part of a decade hurling propaganda across their borders, one denouncing the Bolshevik menace, the other condemning fascist barbarism. Diplomats in London and Paris assumed this mutual hatred made any alliance between Berlin and Moscow unthinkable, a geopolitical impossibility too absurd to entertain seriously. That assumption would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the 20th century. Behind closed doors, away from the attention of foreign embassies and newspaper correspondents, two regimes bound by nothing except their shared appetite for power were quietly opening a channel that would rearrange the map of Europe overnight. When the announcement finally came, in the last week of August 1939, it struck the watching world like a physical blow, the kind of shock that reorders everything a person thought they understood about the age they were living in. The negotiations that produced the pact moved with a speed that itself revealed how long both sides had been quietly preparing the ground. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, flew to Moscow at Hitler's direction, and within a single day of talks with his Soviet counterpart, Vyacheslav Molotov, the broad framework of an agreement was already taking shape. The public document was simple enough in its stated terms. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union would attack the other, and neither would support a third party in any conflict against either signatory. To anyone watching from outside, this appeared to be a calculated piece of pragmatism from two powers seeking to avoid a ruinous war with each other. But the agreement contained a second component that was not released to the world, a secret protocol that divided the whole of Eastern Europe into clearly delineated German and Soviet spheres of influence, parcelling out the fates of nations without consulting a single one of them. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and the eastern half of Poland fell within the Soviet sphere. Germany took the western portion of Poland, and, in subsequent revisions, Lithuania was shifted from one column to the other, as if populations and histories were merely entries in a ledger. For Hitler, the pact was never intended to be anything other than a precisely timed instrument of strategic deception. His private correspondence and recorded conversations from this period leave no ambiguity about his view of the Soviet Union as a racial and ideological enemy that would ultimately have to be destroyed, not managed, not contained, but obliterated. The great temptation of the moment, in Hitler's mind, was the danger of a two-front war, the same strategic nightmare that had consumed Imperial Germany a generation earlier. By binding Stalin's hands with a formal agreement, Hitler purchased the one thing he could not manufacture through military force alone: time and freedom of maneuver in the West. He could turn the full weight of the Wehrmacht against Poland, and from there against France and the Low Countries, without the constant anxiety of a Soviet response on his eastern flank. The pact was, in every meaningful sense, a disposable tool. Hitler signed it with the full intention of discarding it the moment it had served its purpose. Stalin's calculus was more complex, and in certain respects more understandable, though no less ultimately disastrous. The Soviet leader had spent years watching the Western democracies pursue a policy of appeasement toward Hitler, and the Munich Agreement of 1938 had convinced him that Britain and France were content to direct German aggression eastward rather than challenge it themselves. In Stalin's reading, the Western powers were maneuvering to embroil the Soviet Union in a catastrophic war with Germany while they stood safely aside. The non-aggression pact, as he conceived it, was a way of turning that logic around, allowing capitalist powers to tear each other apart while the Soviet Union rearmed and prepared. The secret protocols, meanwhile, offered something immediately concrete: a buffer of territory between Soviet borders and the Wehrmacht. Finland, the Baltic states, and eastern Poland would add depth to Soviet defenses, and depth was something that Soviet military doctrine prized above nearly all other strategic assets. What Stalin did not allow himself to fully reckon with was the fundamental incompatibility between his own assessment of Hitler's timeline and the reality of Hitler's intentions. Stalin calculated that Hitler would not risk war with the Soviet Union until Britain had been fully subdued. It was, in purely logical terms, a reasonable assumption. A rational strategist would not open a second major front while the first remained unresolved. But Hitler, as the men around him were slowly and expensively learning, did not operate on the premises of rational strategy alone. His decisions were driven by ideology, impatience, and a genuine belief that the Soviet state was so internally rotten, corrupted by what Nazi doctrine characterized as Jewish Bolshevist leadership, that a single overwhelming blow would cause the entire structure to collapse. Stalin understood power. He did not adequately understand the man on the other side of the agreement he had just signed. The immediate consequences of the pact unfolded with terrible speed. Within days of its signing, Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Britain and France honored their treaty obligations and declared war on Germany 2 days later. Then, on the 17th of September, Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border from the opposite direction, claiming their designated sphere under the secret protocol. Poland, caught between two overwhelming military machines, ceased to exist as an independent state within weeks. The Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet Union the following year, the pressure applied with barely disguised menace. The Soviet Union moved against Finland in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, a campaign that exposed serious deficiencies in Red Army performance and, fatally, reinforced Hitler's conviction that the Soviet military was far weaker than its size suggested. That Finnish campaign deserves particular attention because of what it communicated to German military planners. The Red Army had struggled against a small but determined Finnish defense force for months before eventually prevailing by sheer weight of numbers, and the performance confirmed in German minds an assessment that the purges of the late 1930s had devastated Soviet military effectiveness. Thousands of experienced Soviet officers had been executed or imprisoned during Stalin's terror, and the effects on command quality and operational coherence were apparent to foreign observers. German Army High Command incorporated these observations directly into the planning assumptions for what would become Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht, fresh from its stunning victories in France and convinced of its own superiority, looked east and saw a colossus with hollow bones. Back in Moscow, the years of the pact brought a strange and uneasy calm. Soviet-German trade continued under the terms of an economic agreement that accompanied the political one. Soviet raw materials, including grain and oil, flowed west to Germany, while German industrial equipment and military technology moved east. The two regimes were, in a darkly ironic sense, supplying each other for the war they would eventually fight. Stalin was reportedly informed of German military preparations along the Soviet frontier on multiple occasions during this period, by sources both foreign and domestic. He did not ignore these reports because he was naive. He dismissed them because they did not fit the framework through which he was reading events, and because he feared that acting on them too visibly might provoke the very conflict he was trying to delay. The relationship between the two regimes during these years carried a persistent underlying tension that no amount of formal diplomacy could fully conceal. There were disputes over spheres of influence in southeastern Europe, competing ambitions in the Balkans, and a growing German unease about Soviet pressure in areas Berlin considered within its own orbit. When Molotov visited Berlin in November of 1940, his pointed questions about German intentions in Finland and Romania rattled his hosts. Hitler had already given his generals the preliminary directive for an invasion of the Soviet Union by this point. Molotov was negotiating the terms of a partnership that Hitler had already privately decided to terminate by force. The secret protocols themselves represented a kind of philosophical confession buried within the pact's architecture. Two regimes that claimed to be ideological movements, each asserting a moral framework for organizing human society, had secretly divided the populations and territories of sovereign nations between themselves like spoils after a robbery. There was no pretense of liberation, no ideological justification offered in the private documents, only the cold geometry of spheres and lines. The men who signed these documents understood exactly what they were doing, and both were willing to do it, because both believed the arrangement served their immediate interests. The difference was that Hitler had already decided, and Stalin had not yet fully admitted to himself, that this was only ever an interval. By the spring of 1941, the interval was running out. German military construction along the Soviet frontier was observable from the air and reported by Soviet border units. The warnings were accumulating at a rate that should have been impossible to dismiss, and yet the logic of the pact continued to exert its hold over Stalin's thinking, not because he trusted Hitler, but because he trusted his own reading of the situation, and his own reading told him that the moment had not yet arrived. The man who had ruthlessly eliminated anyone he perceived as a threat to his power could not bring himself to perceive the greatest threat of all until it was already at his door. The pact had served Hitler precisely as he intended. It had kept Stalin looking in the wrong direction for long enough. When the blow finally fell, it would come not merely as a military assault, but as the full, brutal answer to a question Stalin had refused to ask. By the close of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at what appeared, from his own vantage point, to be the summit of conquest. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Western Europe lay under German occupation. The swastika flew over Paris. Yet in the private corridors of power, in the map rooms of the Reich Chancellery and the guarded deliberations of the Wehrmacht High Command, a different reality was taking shape. The spectacular victories of the previous year had not delivered the decisive peace Hitler needed. Britain had not collapsed. Britain had not even flinched. And from across the Atlantic, the United States was edging closer to the conflict with every passing month, lending ships, supplies, and moral weight to the island nation that refused to yield. Hitler had conquered half a continent and still found himself caught, pinned between enemies he could not quite reach and pressures he could no longer ignore. The British refusal to negotiate was, to Hitler, both a personal affront and a strategic puzzle he could not solve through conventional means. He had expected Churchill to be swept aside, replaced by men willing to accept the new European order. Instead, Churchill hardened public resolve and lobbied Washington with relentless energy. The Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain during the summer of 1940 had already demonstrated that the English Channel was not merely a strip of water, it was a strategic barrier that neutralized German land power almost entirely. The Royal Navy remained strong, the Royal Air Force had proven its resilience, and any seaborne invasion of Britain carried risks that even the Wehrmacht's bravest generals viewed with private alarm. Hitler began to seek a different answer to the British problem, not a military solution directed westward, but one rooted in a calculation of what kept Britain fighting at all. His reasoning, articulated to his inner circle across the winter of 1940 to 1941, followed a logic that was seductive in its simplicity, even as it was extraordinary in its ambition. Britain's continued defiance, Hitler argued, rested on hope, the hope that some future ally might enter the war and tip the balance. Two candidates existed, the Soviet Union and the United States. If Germany could eliminate the Soviet Union quickly, and he was certain it could be done in a single summer campaign, Britain's hope of a continental partner would evaporate. The British government, confronted with Soviet collapse and American neutrality, would finally accept reality and seek terms. In this framing, the war in the East was not a second front at all. It was the solution to the Western problem. It was the way to end the war without ever landing a single soldier on English soil. What made this reasoning particularly dangerous was how sincerely Hitler believed it. His confidence was not performance. It was genuine, rooted in the spectacular successes against France, and fed by a collection of military intelligence reports that consistently underestimated Soviet capacity. German assessments of the Red Army circulated during this period were almost uniformly dismissive. Soviet officer corps had been gutted by Stalin's purges throughout the late 1930s, leaving formations commanded by men promoted far beyond their experience. The Finnish Winter War of 1939 to 1940 had exposed Soviet military dysfunction to the world, with the Red Army suffering enormous casualties against a small Nordic nation, before eventually overwhelming it by sheer weight of numbers. Hitler watched those battles closely. He drew precisely the wrong lesson from them. The economic dimension of the calculation was equally urgent, and in some ways more coldly rational than the strategic fantasizing about Britain. By 1941, Germany's war economy was under severe strain. The rearmament program that had built the Wehrmacht into Europe's most powerful military force had consumed resources at a rate that peacetime planning had never intended to sustain indefinitely. Rubber, oil, grain, iron ore, the raw materials that modern industrial war demanded in vast quantities, were already the subject of careful rationing and anxious ministry reports. Germany controlled much of Western Europe, but Western Europe's resources were not sufficient. The oil fields of Romania provided a fragile lifeline, but they were finite and exposed. Meanwhile, across the border to the east, the vast breadth of Soviet territory contained everything Germany needed: the grain of Ukraine, the coal of the Donbass, the oil of the Caucasus. In Hitler's vision, conquering the Soviet Union was not merely a military operation, it was a resource acquisition project on a continental scale. Senior German economists and planners contributed to this vision, sometimes willingly, sometimes with private reservations they dared not voice aloud. Detailed studies were produced projecting what the captured territories of the Soviet Union could deliver: food surpluses sufficient to feed both Germany and occupied Europe, fuel reserves that would power the Wehrmacht for years, mineral wealth that would render any future blockade meaningless. The projections were extraordinary. They were also, in critical ways, built on assumptions that crumbled under scrutiny. Assumptions about the speed of Soviet collapse, about the willingness of occupied populations to cooperate, and about the ability of German administrative machinery to extract and transport resources across the vast distances of the East. But in the early months of 1941, dissenting voices reached Hitler's ears only in filtered, softened form. There was also the factor of time. Hitler understood, or believed he understood, that Germany's window of opportunity was closing. American industrial capacity was beginning to orient toward war production. Britain was growing stronger, with each month of Lend-Lease material crossing the Atlantic. The Soviet Union was rearming, slowly, chaotically, but rearming nonetheless. If Germany was going to strike east, it had to do so before the balance of forces shifted further against it. This sense of urgency, of a closing door, pervaded the strategic discussions of late 1940 and early 1941. Waiting was not perceived as safety, it was perceived as slow defeat. Action, however dangerous, seemed preferable to a future where the odds grew steadily worse. Hitler had built his entire political career on the conviction that bold action defeated cautious inaction, and this moment felt to him like the proof of that philosophy. The generals were not uniformly enthusiastic. Some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced officers harbored deep misgivings that they expressed in memoranda, in private conversations, and occasionally in direct confrontation with Hitler himself. The concern most frequently raised was logistics, the brutal arithmetic of moving and supplying millions of men across the Soviet Union's primitive road network, over rail lines of a different gauge than Germany's, through a territory so vast that the distances alone threatened to swallow the advance. The Soviet Union covered 11 time zones. The distance from the western border to Moscow alone was greater than the entire width of France. Beyond Moscow lay thousands more kilometers of territory that showed no signs of simply disappearing because Germany had decided to conquer them. These were not abstract worries. They were precise, quantified concerns backed by detailed planning documents. Hitler acknowledged them, dismissed them as the timidity of conventional minds, and continued. The role of ideology in this gamble cannot be separated from the material calculation, because for Hitler they were genuinely inseparable. He did not merely want Soviet resources, he wanted to destroy Bolshevism as a political system, a racial enemy, and a historical force. The war in the East, in his conception, would be a war of annihilation, not a conventional military campaign. Soviet territory was not simply to be occupied and administered, it was to be transformed, depopulated in certain regions, colonized, and permanently incorporated into a German racial empire. This ideological purpose gave the operation an urgency and a character that distinguished it from every previous German military campaign. Defeating France had been a strategic objective. Defeating the Soviet Union was, in Hitler's mind, an existential mission, the fulfillment of the program he had laid out in his published writings more than 15 years before the first shot of Barbarossa was fired. This ideological overlay had practical military consequences that German planners began wrestling with, even in the early stages of preparation. If the war in the East was to be a war of annihilation, then the normal rules of military occupation and administration would not apply. Soviet political commissars were to be shot upon capture. Civilians in certain categories were to be treated not as occupied populations but as racial enemies. These orders, which would grow increasingly explicit as planning progressed, created conditions in the occupied territories that guaranteed partisan resistance and denied Germany the cooperative labor and food surpluses that its economic projections depended upon. The ideological war and the economic war were thus in direct contradiction. But Hitler never confronted this contradiction, because his framework did not allow for it. As spring arrived in 1941, the operation took on the quality of inevitability. Millions of men were moving east through the Reich's railway network. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiling at forward depots along the Polish and Romanian borders. Aircraft were repositioning to eastern airfields. The concentration of force was unprecedented in military history, and maintaining its secrecy required extraordinary effort from German intelligence and security services. The world watched Germany with wary eyes, sensing something vast in preparation, uncertain of its target or its timing. Stalin, receiving warnings from multiple directions, chose not to believe what his intelligence services were telling him, but that is the story of another chapter. What matters here is the nature of the trap that Hitler had constructed for himself as much as for his enemy. He had committed Germany to a war on two fronts: the precise strategic disaster that had broken Germany a generation before, and he had convinced himself, through a chain of reasoning that was part calculation and part wish, that this time would be different. The trap was not merely geographic or military. It was built into the logic of the decision itself, into the gap between what Hitler believed the Soviet Union was and what it actually turned out to be. That gap, invisible in the spring of 1941, would become the defining fact of the war. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes not from ignorance, but from certainty. By the spring of 1941, Joseph Stalin sat at the center of the largest land empire on Earth, surrounded by intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and human sources, all pointing toward the same conclusion. An invasion was coming. The warnings arrived from every direction, from spies embedded in the heart of Berlin, from Soviet military attachés stationed across Europe, from German soldiers who crossed the frontier at night and surrendered themselves to Soviet border guards, rather than participate in what they knew was about to begin. Stalin read some of these reports personally. He annotated them in red pencil, and then, with the methodical calm of a man who had already decided what was true, he dismissed them one by one, labeling their authors provocateurs, fantasists, or agents of British manipulation. The greatest intelligence failure of the 20th century was not a failure of information. It was a failure of the mind that received it. To understand how Stalin arrived at this catastrophic miscalculation, it is necessary to understand the world as he perceived it. He had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August of 1939, not because he trusted Adolf Hitler, he trusted no one, but because he believed he had purchased time to rebuild the Red Army's officer corps, gutted by the purges of the late 1930s. Time to modernize Soviet industry, to push factories east of the Ural Mountains beyond the reach of German bombers. Time, above all, to watch the capitalist powers of Europe exhaust themselves in a war of mutual destruction, while the Soviet Union remained strong and whole. When the warnings of a German invasion began to multiply, Stalin's instinct was not to credit them, but to interrogate their origin. Who benefits from the Soviet Union going to war with Germany prematurely? In his calculation, Britain did, and so the warnings, in his mind, became a British plot to drag him into a conflict on unfavorable terms. Every new intelligence report that said Germany is preparing to attack became to Stalin another data point confirming British treachery rather than German intent. The Soviet intelligence apparatus itself was formidable and deeply compromised by this same logic. Networks operating inside Germany and across occupied Europe fed Moscow Center a continuous stream of high-grade material. Troop concentrations, supply movements, the transfer of railway rolling stock, the relocation of German air units to forward airfields close to the Soviet border. One network, operating through contacts in Switzerland with access to sources near the German High Command, passed detailed warnings that outlined the planned thrust of the German offensive with remarkable accuracy. These reports were received, logged, and filed. When analysts attempted to elevate their significance, they encountered a culture in which the interpretation that Stalin preferred was the only safe one to offer. The purges had not only eliminated officers from the Red Army, they had eliminated independent judgment from the Soviet intelligence establishment. Men who delivered unwelcome truths had a way of disappearing, and everyone who remained understood this. So the reports were softened, their conclusions hedged, their urgency drained away before they ever reached the top. German deserters added a human dimension to the warnings that should have been impossible to dismiss. In the weeks before the invasion, a steady trickle of German soldiers, some motivated by political conviction, some by fear, some by personal circumstance, crossed into Soviet-held territory and informed their captors of what was being prepared on the other side of the wire. They described the massing of armored formations, the stockpiling of ammunition, the briefings given to junior officers about the coming operation. Soviet border commanders forwarded these accounts to Moscow with varying degrees of urgency. What happened to them there was almost uniformly the same. Stalin read the reports and concluded that the German High Command had deliberately sent these men across to spread panic and provoke a Soviet mobilization that Hitler could then use as a pretext for war. The very existence of German soldiers willing to defect became, in Stalin's inverted logic, evidence of a German deception operation rather than evidence of a German invasion. He was so convinced of his own analytical framework that contradictory evidence only reinforced it. On the German side of this equation, the machinery of deception ran with a precision that bordered on the methodical. Operation Barbarossa was compartmentalized to a degree unprecedented in German military planning. Hitler had signed the original directive in December of 1940, and in the months that followed, the distribution of detailed operational orders was controlled with extraordinary care. Senior officers received their specific assignments without necessarily understanding how those assignments fit into the larger design. Units were moved at night. Radio silence was imposed across entire army groups for extended periods. German divisions were transferred to their jump-off positions in stages, using cover stories that attributed their movement to training exercises or preparation for an entirely different theater of war. German military intelligence planted disinformation, suggesting that the build-up in the east was cover for a massive airborne operation against Britain, or perhaps an invasion of the Middle East through Turkey. These stories circulated widely enough that even neutral observers repeated them with confidence. The Luftwaffe's role in maintaining deception was equally deliberate. German aircraft were not allowed to conduct reconnaissance flights deep into Soviet territory in the months immediately before the invasion, an operational restraint that cost German planners certain tactical intelligence but preserved the critical element of strategic surprise. When Soviet pilots occasionally intercepted German reconnaissance aircraft that did approach the border, the incidents were handled diplomatically and with minimal escalation, precisely because neither side wished to provoke a confrontation that would force the other's hand. Stalin specifically ordered that Soviet fighters were not to engage German aircraft over Soviet territory, unwilling to give Hitler any justification for military action. This order, intended to preserve the pact, instead allowed German planners to gather what information they needed, while Soviet commanders were prohibited from the aggressive response that might have signaled genuine military readiness. The Soviet military's own internal confusion compounded every external failure. The Red Army in 1941 was in the middle of a painful transition, reorganizing its armored formations after the lessons of the Finnish Winter War, absorbing massive quantities of new equipment that its crews had not yet learned to operate, attempting to reconstitute a reliable officer corps after years of ideologically driven purges that had eliminated some of its most experienced commanders. The men who had survived the purges were often those who had demonstrated political loyalty over military competence, and many of them were deeply reluctant to act on their own initiative for fear of being accused of provocation or insubordination. When border district commanders began to receive intelligence suggesting imminent attack, several of them quietly placed their units on informal alert, not declaring a full military emergency, which required Moscow's authorization, but positioning men and equipment in ways that might reduce the impact of a sudden blow. These small acts of professional instinct were the exception, not the rule. Stalin's ambassador in Berlin added his voice to the chorus during the spring of 1941, reporting through diplomatic channels that German official circles were discussing the Eastern Campaign not as a possibility, but as a settled decision. German industrialists spoke with unusual candor to their contacts. Military officers stationed in Berlin displayed a quiet confidence that spoke of men who knew something was already in motion. The ambassador's cables described a German capital that felt, to anyone paying close attention, like a city preparing itself psychologically for a new phase of the war, one directed not westward but east. These reports landed in Moscow and prompted the same reaction as all the others. Stalin was convinced that his ambassador was being deliberately fed disinformation, or that the man had simply been fooled. The ambassador's credibility in Moscow declined in proportion to the accuracy of his reporting. At the level of the German High Command, the very scale of the enterprise created its own risks of exposure. Moving roughly 3 million men into position along a frontier of nearly 2,000 kilometers required months of preparation and involved hundreds of thousands of support personnel, logistics staff, railway workers, construction engineers, signals operators, who could not all be kept ignorant of what they were building. German security services monitored communications rigorously and enforced secrecy with harsh penalties, but the sheer mass of human activity along the Soviet frontier was visible to anyone who cared to look. Soviet partisan networks and border patrol units sent back reports of dust clouds rising from forest roads, of bridges being strengthened to bear tank loads, of fuel dumps appearing in locations that served no defensive purpose. These reports went to Moscow. Moscow sent back instructions to avoid provocation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this entire period is the way in which Stalin's miscalculation fed on itself. Each warning he dismissed made the next warning easier to dismiss. Each piece of evidence he reframed as British provocation strengthened the interpretive lens through which all subsequent evidence was filtered. The intelligence system around him adapted to his preferences, and the result was a closed loop, a room in which the walls were built entirely from his own assumptions, and every new report was reshaped to fit the room before it was allowed inside. The people who might have broken the loop, the officers and analysts who understood what the evidence actually meant, had either been purged, imprisoned, or trained by bitter experience into silence. By June of 1941, the Soviet Union was arguably the most warned nation in the history of warfare, and simultaneously one of the least prepared for what was about to happen. The Germans crossed the frontier in the dark hours of the 22nd of June 1941, and in those first terrible minutes, the full weight of both failures became real in the most brutal way possible, not in conference rooms or intelligence files, but in burning aircraft and collapsing command posts, and the faces of soldiers who had been told, again and again, that the enemy at the wire was a fiction. The warnings had been there. Every piece of the picture had been available. What was missing was not intelligence. What was missing was the willingness to believe what the intelligence said, and that absence, that single catastrophic gap between knowing and acting, would cost the Soviet Union more than any army could have taken from it by force alone. In the first weeks of 1941, something extraordinary began to happen across the breadth of occupied Europe. Quietly, methodically, without fanfare or public announcement, the machinery of the German military state began to move. Freight trains rolled east through the long Polish nights, their cargo shrouded under tarpaulins. Infantry divisions that had spent the winter garrisoned in France and the Low Countries received movement orders and began the slow, grinding journey toward the Soviet frontier. Quartermaster depots swelled with ammunition, rations and fuel. To anyone watching closely, the pattern was unmistakable. To those who chose not to see, it remained invisible. This was the gathering of a force without precedent in the history of warfare. A deliberate, months-long accumulation of human and mechanical power aimed at a single objective: the destruction of the Soviet Union before the summer was out. The numbers alone strain the imagination. By the time the final preparations were complete, in the third week of June 1941, Germany had positioned roughly 3 million men along a frontier stretching nearly 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian foothills in the south. More than 7,000 armored vehicles, ranging from light reconnaissance tanks to heavy panzers, stood ready in their assembly areas, engines maintained and fueled. Thousands of aircraft of every type lined the airfields of occupied Poland and East Prussia, their crews briefed and waiting. Hundreds of thousands of horses, for the Wehrmacht remained far more dependent on animal power than its reputation for mechanized warfare suggested, had been requisitioned from across Europe and driven east. Artillery pieces of every caliber had been stockpiled in batteries that ran without interruption along the length of the front. It was, by any honest measure, the largest single offensive force ever assembled in human history to that point. 3 army groups formed the operational backbone of the enterprise. Army Group North, positioned in East Prussia, was tasked with driving through the Baltic states and toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the 3, would strike through Belarus in the direction of Moscow, along the old invasion road that armies had used for centuries. Army Group South faced the vast open steppes of Ukraine, its objectives including the agricultural heartland and the industrial cities of the Dnieper River basin. Each army group contained a mixture of armored, motorized, and standard infantry formations. The panzers intended to race ahead and encircle Soviet forces, while the foot soldiers closed the pockets and destroyed what remained. The plan was elegant in theory, relying on speed and shock to shatter the Soviet command structure before it could respond coherently. What the plan required in practice, the continuous, reliable flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts across enormous distances, was a problem of a fundamentally different and far more troubling character. The logistical architecture of Operation Barbarossa was, from its inception, a structure built on assumptions rather than certainties. German planners estimated the campaign would last no more than 8 to 10 weeks. Some in the Army High Command spoke of the Soviet state as a rotten structure that would collapse at the first serious blow. This belief, sincere, deeply held, and catastrophically wrong, shaped every logistical calculation that followed. If the campaign lasted only weeks, supply stockpiles needed only to sustain those weeks. If Soviet resistance crumbled quickly, the advancing German forces would capture Soviet depots and live off the land. If the roads were bad, the bad roads would only need to be endured briefly. Every assumption stacked neatly upon the last, and together they produced a logistical plan that made a swift victory possible, but made a prolonged campaign nearly impossible to sustain. The road network was the first and most visible problem. Germany's military machine had been optimized for Western Europe, where a dense web of paved roads and modern highways allowed motorized columns to move at pace. The Soviet Union was not Western Europe. Beyond the major cities, roads were largely unpaved tracts of compacted earth and gravel, serviceable in dry summer conditions, but prone to becoming rivers of mud with the first sustained rainfall. German transport officers who traveled the roads in the months before the invasion filed reports that were alarming in their specificity. Axle-deep ruts, surfaces that disintegrated under heavy loads, bridges rated for loads far below what military columns demanded. The Wehrmacht's trucks, already a heterogeneous collection of vehicles from a dozen manufacturers, a legacy of hasty rearmament, were not built for these conditions. Tire wear accelerated dramatically on rough surfaces. Suspension systems failed. Spare parts that had been plentiful in France became scarce before the columns had travelled a quarter of the distance to Moscow. The railway question was, if anything, more serious still. Rail was the lifeblood of any large-scale military operation, the only means by which sufficient tonnage could be moved over sufficient distances to keep an army of millions in the field. The Soviet rail network was extensive, but it ran on a broader gauge than the standard European gauge used by German rolling stock. Every kilometre of track, captured from the Soviets, would need to be converted before German locomotives and wagons could use it, a laborious process requiring specialized teams, tools, and materials. German railway engineers had calculated the conversion rates as precisely as they could, but the math produced a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. The conversion work could not keep pace with the rate of advance the planners projected. There would always be a gap, a growing gap, between where the fighting was happening and where the railheads capable of supplying it were located. In that gap, horse-drawn wagons and overloaded trucks would have to carry the difference. They would not always manage it. Fuel presented its own cascading problem. The panzer divisions that formed the armoured spearheads of each army group consumed enormous quantities of fuel at exactly the moments when they were moving fastest and furthest from their supply bases. A successful armoured thrust, deep, rapid, driving into the Soviet rear, was simultaneously the most tactically desirable outcome and the most logistically dangerous one. The further the panzers advanced, the longer and more vulnerable the supply lines behind them, and the greater the consumption required simply to move the fuel trucks forward to reach them. German planners had calculated minimum fuel requirements with some care, but those calculations assumed roads that did not exist, weather that did not cooperate, and an enemy that would oblige by collapsing on schedule. None of these conditions could be guaranteed. Ammunition was stockpiled in quantities that seemed, on paper, more than adequate for a campaign measured in weeks. Depots were established at intervals behind the frontier, holding tens of thousands of tons of shells, cartridges, and explosives. The problem was not the initial stockpile, but the rate at which it would be consumed against a Soviet enemy who, German planners had rather hopefully projected, would disintegrate under the first sustained pressure. If the Soviets chose to fight stubbornly and at length, something their enormous reserves of manpower made entirely possible, the ammunition stockpiles would diminish far faster than they could be replenished along the strained supply lines. Here, as in so many other areas of Barbarossa's logistics, the plan worked if the assumptions were correct and failed if they were not. The soldiers themselves were among the last of the preparations to be fully readied, though in some respects they were the most troubling variable of all. The 3 million men assembling along the frontier were, in the main, hardened veterans of the Polish and French campaigns, confident in their commanders and in themselves. They believed what they had been told, that this would be a short campaign, a blitzkrieg of unprecedented scale that would be over before the Russian autumn arrived. They packed accordingly. Summer uniforms, summer equipment, summer rations. Almost no provision was made for cold weather clothing or winter operations, a decision that would exact a terrible price before the year was out. The men themselves were willing enough, even eager. They did not know what they did not know, that the country they were preparing to enter had swallowed armies before, that its distances were not the distances of France, and that its people, whatever the theory said about Soviet fragility, had a capacity for endurance that no blitzkrieg could simply dissolve. The horses deserve their own consideration, often overlooked in accounts that focus on the gleaming panzer columns. More than 600,000 horses were allocated to Barbarossa, pulling artillery, supply wagons, and field kitchens across the length of the front. These animals were the Wehrmacht's true connective tissue, the gap fillers between what the trucks could carry and what the army actually needed. But horses, too, consumed resources, fodder and water, in quantities that competed with everything else the supply system was trying to move forward. They were vulnerable to disease, exhaustion, and the same terrible cold that would claim so many of their human handlers. In a campaign that prided itself on modernity and mechanized might, these ancient creatures carried a share of the burden that no one particularly wished to advertise. As June 1941 approached, the preparations reached their final crescendo. The last divisions moved into their assembly areas. Artillery batteries registered their targets. Luftwaffe crews studied their target maps. Along the entire length of the frontier, the accumulated weight of months of effort sat poised and waiting, an enormous coiled spring held at maximum tension. The German officers who understood logistics, and there were honest men among them who had looked at the numbers carefully and felt the cold weight of doubt, wrote their concerns into their diaries and filed their reservations in reports that travelled up the chain of command and were noted and set aside. Hitler had decided. The plan was set. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 22nd of June, the spring would be released, and the largest military operation in human history would begin its journey toward a destiny that none of its architects had accurately foreseen. There is a particular quality to the silence that precedes catastrophe. In the hours before dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, that silence stretched across more than 1,000 miles of frontier, from the Baltic coast in the north to the Carpathian foothills in the south. Soviet border guards moved through their routines. Sentries smoked in the dark. In garrison towns a few kilometers behind the wire, officers slept in their beds, some having attended dances and concerts the evening before. The night was warm, the sky beginning its slow surrender to summer light. Nothing in the ordinary rhythm of that morning suggested that the largest military operation in human history was roughly 4 hours from its opening salvo. Behind the German lines, the machinery of war had been coiling since midnight. More than 3 million men stood in their positions along the forward edge, many of them having received their orders only days before. Panzer crews sat inside their vehicles, engines cold, waiting for the signal. Artillery batteries had been registered on their targets, Soviet command posts, communication hubs, bridge approaches, troop concentrations, with a precision that had taken months of careful reconnaissance to achieve. Luftwaffe ground crews had been working through the darkness, fueling aircraft and loading ordnance, preparing strikes timed to catch Soviet planes still on the ground, wingtip to wingtip, as the dawn light made them visible. The German military machine, refined by the conquest of Poland, France, and the Balkans, was at the absolute apex of its confidence. What came next was not an improvisation, it was a coiled spring. At roughly 0300 hours, German forward units began the quiet process of eliminating Soviet border observation posts. Small assault teams, pioneers, infantry specialists, moved silently through the dark to neutralize sentries before they could raise any alarm. Some Soviet border guards managed to fire their weapons. A few managed to get brief, fragmentary messages back to their regimental headquarters before the lines went dead. Those messages arrived at commands already in a state of deliberate confusion, passed upward through a chain of authority that had been systematically conditioned to disbelieve precisely this kind of report. One more alarm from the frontier. One more provocation to be reported carefully, calmly, so as not to antagonize the Germans. The messages went up the chain. The chain hesitated, and then, at 0400 hours, the darkness was replaced by fire. The German artillery barrage that opened Barbarossa was not simply loud, it was the kind of sound that reorganizes the human nervous system. Thousands of guns opened simultaneously along the entire length of the front, the concussion rolling across the flat western plains of the Soviet Union in a continuous, tearing roar. Soviet positions that had been located during weeks of patient reconnaissance were struck with concentrated fire. Command bunkers collapsed. Communications trenches were churned into rubble. Telephone lines, already fragile, already inadequately maintained, were severed in hundreds of places within the first minutes. Soviet soldiers who had been sleeping minutes before found themselves in an entirely different world, a world of fire and noise and collapsing structures, with no orders coming down, no information about what was happening, and no framework for understanding the scale of what had just been set in motion. While the artillery hammered the ground forces, the Luftwaffe was already airborne. German bomber and fighter formations crossed the frontier at extremely low altitude in the pre-dawn darkness, their navigation carefully planned to bring them over Soviet airfields at roughly the moment that growing light would make the targets visible, but Soviet ground defenses would still be unready. What they found at airfield after airfield was an attacker's dream. Rows of Soviet aircraft standing in neat lines, closely parked, without revetments to protect them, without the dispersal that any serious anticipation of attack would have demanded. Fuel tankers stood adjacent to aircraft. Maintenance crews were arriving for the morning shift. In some cases, Soviet aircraft had been freshly painted and repositioned the previous day, not for combat readiness, but for an inspection. The Luftwaffe struck these fields with incendiary bombs and strafing runs, igniting aircraft that burned into their neighbors, setting off fuel stores, destroying maintenance equipment. At dozens of fields across the western military districts, the Soviet Air Force ceased to exist as an effective force before many of its pilots had finished breakfast. The commanders responsible for Soviet forces in the western districts were, in many cases, physically unable to understand what was happening to them. Communications had collapsed. Runners and motorcycle dispatch riders could cover only small distances and carried only fragments of information. A divisional commander might know that his forward regiment had been hit hard and was not responding, while knowing nothing at all about what was happening to his neighboring divisions. Corps commanders received contradictory reports, or no reports at all. Army commanders, attempting to relay information to Moscow, found their own communications intermittent and unreliable. The Soviet military had invested heavily in the theory of offensive warfare and had done almost nothing to prepare its command structures for the chaos of being struck first. In those first hours, the entire edifice of Soviet Western defense was not defeated so much as it was simply blinded, cut off from itself, and left to react to events it could not see or measure. In Moscow, the news arrived in pieces, each piece more alarming than the last, and each piece struggling against the institutional weight of a system trained to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear. The People's Commissar of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff had already been attempting to reach Stalin before the barrage opened, aware that something catastrophic was developing along the frontier. When they finally reached him, the first exchanges apparently circled around the question of whether this was a provocation or a genuine attack, a distinction that had been brutally relevant for months and was now utterly meaningless. An order eventually went to Soviet forces authorizing them to respond to the attack, while, extraordinarily, still cautioning against crossing into German territory. The Soviet military machine, enormous in its raw mass, was being asked to fight back through a chain of command that had just been systematically dismantled, using communications that no longer functioned, following directives that had been written for a different kind of war. German panzer formations, held back from the very first moments so that the artillery and airstrikes could do their preparatory work, began to cross the frontier in force as the morning light strengthened. At the points of main effort, in the north toward Leningrad, in the center toward Moscow, in the south toward Kiev and beyond, German armor crossed rivers and broke through the disrupted Soviet forward positions with a speed that even the most optimistic German planners had hoped for rather than expected. Soviet units that had survived the initial bombardment and attempted to form defensive lines found those lines flanked before they could consolidate. Tanks moved around resistance rather than into it. Motorized infantry followed closely, clearing pockets and pushing the momentum forward. The essence of what Germany had learned in France and Poland, strike fast, bypass strength, penetrate deep, sever the arteries of command, was being applied with full force against an opponent that had been specifically and systematically prevented from preparing for it. By midday of that first day, the scale of the catastrophe was becoming legible even through the fog and noise of battle. At some sectors, German formations had already advanced more than 60 kilometers into Soviet territory. Soviet units that had been positioned in the forward areas, the very units that Stalin had insisted remain there, refusing to allow any defensive reorganization that might signal hostile intent to Berlin, were now surrounded or in headlong retreat, often without ammunition resupply, without communications, without orders. Entire formations ceased to exist, not because they were destroyed in pitched battle, but because they were cut off, their supply routes severed, their headquarters overrun, their soldiers left without any organizing authority. The frontier armies, which represented some of the best-equipped forces the Soviet Union possessed, were hemorrhaging in a matter of hours. The cost in aircraft alone was staggering. By the end of that first day, Soviet losses in the air ran to numbers that commanders in Moscow struggled to absorb, and that many refused to transmit accurately upward, fearing the consequences of honest reporting in a system that punished bad news. The Luftwaffe had achieved something approaching air supremacy over the entire front within the first 24 hours, not through a prolonged air campaign, but through the surgical destruction of Soviet air power on the ground. German bombers could now operate with near impunity over Soviet supply columns, rail junctions, and retreating formations. The Red Army had lost one of its most critical defensive assets before many of its soldiers had fired a single shot. For the soldiers of the Red Army caught in those first hours, the experience defied any framework of military training or political preparation they had been given. Soviet propaganda had told them that any future war would be fought on enemy soil, that Soviet forces would advance, that the working class of enemy nations would rise in support. Nothing in that preparation had described this. Artillery fire from the dark, fires where aircraft used to be, columns of men retreating along roads clogged with civilian refugees, officers issuing contradictory orders from headquarters that were themselves already moving rearward. Some units fought with extraordinary courage, holding positions against armored assault with anti-tank guns and rifles, buying hours that they could not know were desperately needed. Others simply dissolved under the pressure, the bonds of unit cohesion severed by the speed and completeness of the collapse around them. Both responses were rational. Neither was sufficient. The opening hours of Barbarossa revealed something that neither side had fully understood before that morning. the distance between military power on paper and military power in the field. The Soviet Union possessed more tanks, more aircraft, and more men in the western districts than Germany had committed to the initial assault. None of that numerical reality mattered in those first hours, because numerical strength cannot be converted into battlefield effect without the connective tissue of communications, command, and preparation, and all of that connective tissue had been cut. Germany, by contrast, had spent 2 years perfecting the art of moving fast enough to outrun an opponent's ability to respond. On the 22nd of June 1941, that art reached its most brutal expression. The summer ahead would be catastrophic, but even then, on that first terrible day, the seeds of Germany's own eventual undoing were already present. Because the Soviet Union, for all its catastrophic losses, had not been destroyed. It had merely been struck, and it would, with enormous suffering and across enormous distance, begin to rise again. In the opening weeks of Barbarossa, the German army achieved something that defied the logic of modern warfare: the swift annihilation of vast Soviet formations, not through direct assault alone, but through a tactic so devastating that entire armies ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. This was encirclement, the tactical marriage of speed and coordination that German commanders had perfected in Poland and France, now deployed at a scale that would have seemed impossible had the results not been so horrifyingly real. German panzer divisions, moving at speeds that left Soviet defenders reeling, did not simply drive through Soviet lines. They curved around them, closed the pincers, and trapped everything between the jaws. What followed was not quick destruction, but the systematic annihilation of surrounded armies, surrounded not by fortifications or natural obstacles, but by the pure velocity of German mechanized warfare. The first weeks of summer 1941 witnessed 3 colossal envelopment operations, each one consuming hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, each one seemingly confirming that the Wehrmacht had stumbled upon a formula for victory so elegant, so perfect, that the Soviet Union could not endure it. The first calamity befell Soviet forces around the city of Minsk, deep in western Russia, where German Army Group Center executed its opening maneuver in the second week of the invasion. Soviet commanders, still absorbing the shock of German artillery fire raining down upon their unprepared positions, found themselves unable to coordinate a coherent response as panzer columns burst through their lines with overwhelming speed. The German 4th Panzer Group, under General Hoth, drove eastward from the north, while the 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by General Guderian, swept upward from the south, and the jaws of the trap began to close. Soviet commanders in the region, including General Pavel Karpov, attempted to organize withdrawals and consolidate defensive positions, but the very speed of German movement made organized retreat impossible. Communication lines were severed, divisions became isolated from their parent corps, and the chaos of the opening days transformed into absolute catastrophe. By the end of June, more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in a vast pocket around Minsk, surrounded by German units and unable to break out. The Soviet formations caught in this trap were not remnants or stragglers. They were entire armies with artillery, anti-tank guns, and mechanized units, yet all of it rendered useless by the simple fact of encirclement. German forces, outnumbered in some local sectors, nonetheless held the surrounded troops at bay through sheer momentum and firepower, gradually compressing the pocket and reducing the trapped Soviet armies to submission through attrition and starvation. The destruction around Minsk was only the prelude to a far larger catastrophe unfolding to the east. As German mechanized forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they executed a second, even more ambitious envelopment operation centered on the city of Smolensk, roughly 300 kilometers east of Minsk. The German 4th Panzer Group and the 2nd Panzer Group, operating in coordination with Army infantry following in their wake, repeated their encircling maneuver on an even grander scale. By early July, Soviet formations in the region, including elements of the Soviet Western Front under General Dmitry Pavlov, found themselves surrounded in a massive pocket extending across hundreds of square kilometers. Unlike the Minsk pocket, which had formed relatively quickly, the Smolensk encirclement lasted for weeks, a grinding, relentless process of compression as German units slowly tightened their grip around the trapped Soviet forces. Soviet commanders made desperate attempts to break out, hurling counterattacks against the German cordon, but each attempt failed, draining away more men and equipment that could not be replaced. By the time the Smolensk pocket was finally liquidated in mid-August, more than 400,000 Soviet soldiers had been captured or killed. The scale of these numbers was almost incomprehensible. Entire Soviet armies were ceasing to exist, swallowed whole by the machinery of German warfare, their men marching into captivity or burial, while the German advance rolled on without pause. Yet even as the Smolensk pocket was still being compressed, German panzer forces were already executing the final and most spectacular of the summer envelopments. This one centered on the ancient city of Kiev in Ukraine. The operation unfolded with a textbook precision that seemed to confirm the apparent invincibility of German mechanized warfare. German 4th Panzer Group, operating in support of Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, swept around the Soviet southwest front, while German mechanized columns drove from other directions, creating a vast pocket that would ultimately contain more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers. Kiev itself, the capital of Ukraine, and a city of profound historical significance to the Soviet Union, sat at the center of this trap, its garrison and the surrounding Soviet formations seemingly doomed from the moment the encirclement closed. Soviet commanders, including General Mikhail Kirponos, attempted to organize breakout attempts, and the fighting around the Kiev pocket was among the most intense of the opening months. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Soviet forces that had been surrounded could not break out without weapons they did not have, reinforcements that would not come, and coordination that the destroyed communication systems made impossible. The Germans estimated that more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the Kiev encirclement, though the actual numbers remain disputed by historians. What was not disputed was the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. In 3 massive envelopment operations unfolding between late June and mid-September, the Wehrmacht had destroyed or captured the better part of 3 Soviet army groups, inflicting military defeats that on any European battlefield would have signaled absolute, irrevocable collapse. The mechanics of these encirclement victories revealed why German commanders had grown so confident in their apparent invincibility. The panzer divisions possessed a speed that Soviet mechanized units could not match, a coordination that German General Staff training had perfected, and a concentration of force that allowed them to punch through Soviet lines at decisive points. German tank commanders, equipped with superior radios that allowed coordination across distances that left Soviet commanders isolated and silent, could maneuver with a fluidity that Soviet forces simply could not replicate. The T-26 and T-35 tanks that formed the backbone of Soviet armored forces were slower, less reliable, and often crewed by men with minimal training, while German panzer crews had endured years of intensive preparation and practice. German artillery support was coordinated with lethal efficiency, striking Soviet columns at moments of maximum vulnerability, shredding formations that were attempting to concentrate for counterattacks or breakout attempts. The very world of Western Russia, vast and open, seemed to favor German mechanized warfare. There were no narrow channels to force German columns into constricted killing zones, no urban terrain to negate German advantages in coordination and armor. Soviet commanders, facing an enemy that moved faster, fought more coherently, and struck with more concentrated force, found themselves overmatched in every dimension of operational warfare. Yet even as German panzer commanders celebrated their victories, a subtle but profoundly troubling reality was beginning to assert itself. The surrounded Soviet armies, though encircled and defeated, were not simply ceasing to exist. They were being captured, yes, but in numbers that strained German logistics and defied easy processing. German quartermasters reported that the supply of food for prisoners was already becoming problematic. The roads leading westward were clogged with columns of captured Soviet soldiers, hundreds of thousands of men who had to be guarded, fed, and processed. German divisions reported casualties that, while lighter than Soviet losses, were nonetheless mounting steadily. Frostbite had not yet arrived, but the intensity of close quarters fighting in and around the encircled pockets exacted a steady toll. More troubling still was a phenomenon that German commanders found profoundly disturbing. After each vast encirclement, after each massive capture and destruction of Soviet forces, new Soviet armies seemed to emerge from the depths of the Soviet Union, fresh formations that had not existed on German intelligence maps, appearing to oppose the German advance. The speed and scale of Soviet mobilization began to suggest something that German commanders had fundamentally underestimated. The Soviet Union did not appear to be running out of soldiers. The distances involved in these operations also began to reveal strains in the German advance that would only deepen as the summer progressed. The panzer divisions that had executed these brilliant encirclements had operated at the absolute extreme of their supply lines. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition had to traverse roads that were barely more than tracks in the soft earth of Western Russia. As the German advance pushed farther east, the distances grew longer and the roads remained primitive, and the strain on German logistics intensified with each kilometer of advance. Panzer divisions reported that they were operating at reduced fuel allowances, that ammunition for supporting artillery was being rationed, and that the maintenance of vehicles was becoming increasingly difficult in conditions where replacement parts were scarce, and repair facilities were days of travel away. The German assumption that they could supply armies at the end of 1,000-mile supply lines from depots in Germany proved to be the assumption of men who had never grappled with the reality of logistics on such a vast scale. Soviet scorched earth tactics, meanwhile, meant that captured territory yielded far less in the way of supplies than German planners had anticipated. Soviet forces pulled back intact industrial equipment, destroyed grain stores and livestock, and left the advancing Germans with devastated territory that could not sustain them. The 3 summer encirclements had achieved something remarkable. They had proven that in open-field mechanized warfare, German tactical superiority was absolute, and the Soviet Union's conventional military forces were catastrophically vulnerable. German commanders, surveying the captured territories and the vast numbers of prisoners streaming westward, began to allow themselves to believe that the Soviet Union was in fact as fragile as Hitler had promised. Yet beneath these tactical triumphs lay a strategic paradox that German commanders had not fully confronted. The Soviet Union, though defeated in every major engagement, was not surrendering. Soviet soldiers were retreating, yes, regrouping, yes, but they were not laying down their weapons and accepting the fact of German victory. Even as hundreds of thousands were captured, more Soviet soldiers were being mobilized in the depths of the Soviet Union. Even as vast territories were conquered, Soviet resistance remained fierce and organized in new defensive positions farther east. The Wehrmacht had won every battle, executed encirclements that would be studied in military academies for generations, captured more prisoners than any army in history, and yet the war continued. The German army, for the first time, began to contemplate a possibility that Hitler had forbidden them even to whisper. That tactical victory, however brilliant and comprehensive, might not be sufficient to achieve strategic success. The scale of German logistical strain was becoming acute by midsummer, even as the tactical victories continued to accumulate. German panzer divisions reported that they were operating with fuel reserves that allowed only a few more days of rapid advance. The trucks carrying supplies from depots in Western Russia and Germany were themselves consuming vast quantities of fuel, and the equation of supply and consumption was moving inexorably toward collapse. German commanders began to understand, with a growing sense of dread, that the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks was facing a problem that armor and training could not solve. The simple fact that supplying 3 million men across 1,000 kilometers of primitive roads in the depths of Russia was perhaps impossible. Soviet quartermaster services were also strained to the breaking point, but the Soviet Union possessed one advantage that Germany did not: the ability to manufacture weapons and ammunition on Soviet soil, deep within the Soviet Union, beyond the reach of German air superiority. German industry, meanwhile, was already working at maximum capacity to supply an army that was simultaneously invading Russia and attempting to garrison occupied France and prepare for a potential American invasion. By late summer, the German advance was beginning to slow, not because of defeat in battle. German armies continued to win nearly every engagement with Soviet forces, but because of the exhaustion of supply lines and the growing understanding among senior German commanders that the Barbarossa campaign could not end in a single summer. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff, began making notes in his diary, expressing grave doubts about the feasibility of the operation, though he dared not voice these doubts to Hitler. General Heinz Guderian, the panzer commander whose mobile warfare doctrine had made the encirclement victories possible, was already arguing that German forces should consolidate their gains and prepare for a winter campaign. Hitler, receiving reports of the massive encirclements and the vast numbers of prisoners captured, interpreted these victories as confirmation that the Soviet Union was on the verge of final collapse. He ordered the advance to continue, pushing even deeper into the Soviet Union, determined that the final blow would be delivered before winter set in. What Hitler did not fully understand, and what his generals were beginning to realize, was that the 3 massive envelopments of the summer had been victories of such completeness that they disguised a more profound reality. The German army was already stretched beyond its limits, and the Soviet Union, though bleeding catastrophically, was not surrendering. The contrast between these tactical victories and the strategic stalemate that was beginning to emerge would define the remainder of the Barbarossa campaign. German commanders had proven that they could fight circles around Soviet armies in open terrain, that they could maneuver with a precision and speed that shattered Soviet formations, and that they could sustain advances across hundreds of kilometers. What they had not proven, and what they were increasingly beginning to suspect, was that this tactical mastery could translate into the strategic victory that Hitler demanded. The Soviet Union had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the summer encirclements, but it still possessed armies. It had lost vast territories, but it still possessed depth. It had been defeated in every major battle, but it had not been defeated as a nation or as a military power. The 3 summer envelopments had captured the imagination of the German High Command and confirmed Hitler in his conviction that his invasion would succeed, but they had also set the stage for a confrontation between German operational brilliance and Soviet material endurance, a confrontation in which brilliance, however perfect, might not be sufficient against the vast resources of a nation that had learned, through catastrophic defeat, how to wage total war. By early autumn in 1941, the German army stood at the threshold of what many officers believed would be its finest hour. The men who had conquered France in 6 weeks, who had shattered the Polish state in less than a month, now controlled territory stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. More than 2 million Soviet soldiers languished in German prisoner of war camps, many destined to die of starvation and exposure. Entire Soviet armies had been annihilated in the opening months of the campaign. German panzer divisions had advanced nearly 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory, far exceeding even the most optimistic projections from the planning stages. The speed of the German blitzkrieg seemed to validate everything the Wehrmacht had learned in France and everything Hitler believed about Soviet weakness and German superiority. Yet beneath this veneer of triumph, German commanders, men accustomed to clarity and certainty, began to confront evidence that the campaign was not proceeding according to plan. The first cracks appeared in the narrative of inevitable victory. Soviet resistance, which intelligence reports had predicted would collapse as cities fell and vast encirclements destroyed entire formations, instead stiffened and grew more organized. German units that had expected to face a demoralized, incompetent enemy began to encounter Soviet soldiers fighting with increasing skill and desperation. The frontline reports trickling back to German Army High Command told a story very different from the triumphalist communiques being broadcast to the German public. Yes, massive encirclement victories had destroyed Soviet forces at Minsk, Smolensk, and elsewhere. Yes, Soviet casualties mounted into the millions. But the Soviet Union continued to resist. Replacement divisions appeared from the depths of the Soviet state, seemingly endless and increasingly well-equipped. The myth of Soviet military inferiority, a cornerstone of German strategic thinking, began to crumble against the hard reality of combat. The appearance of new Soviet tank designs crystallized German anxieties about underestimating their enemy. German reconnaissance and frontline reports brought word of a remarkable new machine, the T-34 medium tank. Earlier German tanks, particularly the Panzer IV, with its relatively modest gun, had dominated Soviet armor in the opening months. But the T-34 represented a quantum leap in design philosophy. Its sloped armor deflected anti-tank fire with devastating effectiveness. Its gun was more powerful than most German tank weapons. Its mobility exceeded many German designs. For the first time since the opening of Barbarossa, German panzer commanders encountered a vehicle that fought them on nearly equal terms, and in some circumstances, superior terms. The psychological effect rippled through German armored formations. Officers who had grown accustomed to technical superiority suddenly confronted machines that challenged their assumptions. The T-34 was not a stopgap or an experiment. Soviet factories were producing it in ever-increasing numbers, and it would remain a formidable weapon for the remainder of the war. The Soviet command structure, initially shattered by the German onslaught, had begun the painful process of learning and adaptation. The opening months of Barbarossa had witnessed catastrophic Soviet military failures rooted in poor strategy, inadequate preparation, and the paralysis induced by Stalin's initial miscalculation of Hitler's intentions. Soviet generals found themselves operating under constraints imposed by Stalin's purges of the late 1930s, which had decapitated the officer corps and left survivors reluctant to exercise independent judgment. Yet through trial and error measured in thousands of dead soldiers, Soviet commanders at the operational level began to understand the mechanics of German blitzkrieg and to develop countermeasures. They learned to avoid encirclement by withdrawing when necessary, rather than fighting to the last man. They began to mass reserves and armor in preparation for German assaults rather than dispersing forces. Soviet general staffs, initially amateurish in their planning, grew increasingly sophisticated in coordinating large-scale operations. The raw courage of Soviet soldiers, which had never been in question, now began to be matched by improving military competence. The Wehrmacht could no longer rely on tactical superiority to compensate for Soviet numerical advantage. The vast distances of Soviet territory, which German planners had regarded as manageable obstacles, revealed themselves as strategic realities of crushing significance. German armies had advanced across 1,000 kilometers of Russian steppe and forest, occupying more territory than the entire area of France. But occupation meant little when the Wehrmacht could not consolidate control, establish secure supply lines, or prevent the emergence of partisan resistance in rear areas. The distances that had seemed to promise rapid annihilation of the Soviet state instead became a nightmare for logistics officers struggling to feed and supply armies operating at the extreme end of their supply lines. What had worked in France, where distances were measured in hundreds rather than thousands of kilometers, proved barely workable in Russia. Soviet counteroffensives, though poorly coordinated and often defeated at the tactical level, nevertheless demonstrated the existence of reserves and the will to challenge German territorial gains. The Soviet Union was not behaving like Poland or France, nations that had collapsed into political and military dissolution after decisive defeats. Instead, despite unprecedented losses and occupation of vast territory, the Soviet system remained intact and functional. Resources flowed from Eastern Soviet factories to reinforce Western armies. New formations were raised and thrown into the line to replace shattered units. The weather, which German planners had regarded with almost contemptuous dismissal, began to transform the strategic picture with inexorable force. Summer turned to autumn, and with the change came the Rasputitsa, the dreaded season of mud that Russian soldiers had feared and German planners had underestimated. The primitive road network of the Soviet Union, barely adequate for Russian conditions, proved utterly inadequate for the demands of mechanized warfare. Trucks that had maintained supply lines to German spearheads became bogged down in seas of mud that could swallow an entire vehicle. The famous German road builders, legendary for their skill and efficiency, could not maintain pace with the advancing armies. Distances that had taken weeks to traverse during summer now required months, as the mechanical reliability of vehicles declined and the physical movement of supplies became a grinding process. Ammunition consumption, already exceeding supply capacity, continued at rates that could not be sustained once weather degraded the road network. The summer offensive that was supposed to have concluded the Russian campaign by November no longer appeared feasible. German armies, advancing across hostile territory toward an enemy that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, now faced the prospect of conducting a campaign into winter without securing the resources, territory, or victories that would make such an extended operation viable. The reality that began to crystallize in German high command circles during autumn 1941 was profoundly discomforting to men trained to think in terms of strategic decisiveness and military victory. The campaign had not developed as planned. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. Soviet resistance had not been eliminated, but rather reorganized and stiffened. New weapons, new tactics, and new reserves continued to appear. The vast encirclement victories of summer, which seemed to guarantee the destruction of Soviet military power, instead appeared as tactical triumphs achieved at the opening of a much longer campaign. German commanders who had expected to conduct a winter campaign of conquest in the Caucasus or occupation of the Ukraine instead confronted the prospect of establishing winter lines, while Soviet forces remained undefeated and capable of launching counteroffensives. The Wehrmacht faced the possibility that the quick victory promised to Hitler, and which operational planners had envisioned, would not materialize. Instead, Germany faced the prospect of a long war of attrition on the Eastern Front, a war that played directly to Soviet numerical superiority and away from German advantages in mobility, training, and technical innovation. The impact of this recognition on German strategic planning proved immediate and profound. Hitler, who had maintained faith in a rapid Soviet collapse, became increasingly fixated on achieving knockout blows that would shatter Soviet resistance and force surrender. Rather than consolidating positions or preparing for a prolonged campaign, Hitler began to conceive of new offensives, new concentrations of force, aimed at vital objectives that would, he believed, compel Soviet surrender. The oil fields of the Caucasus became an obsession, as if controlling these resources would somehow transform the strategic situation and secure the fuel supplies that Germany desperately needed. Hitler's generals, lacking the strategic clarity they had possessed at the campaign's opening, found themselves increasingly constrained by Hitler's unwillingness to acknowledge that the Barbarossa campaign had not developed as planned. The comfortable certainty of summer had given way to uncertainty and fear. German officers who had commanded in France, who had tasted victory and believed in German military superiority, now confronted the possibility that their enemy was not only undefeated, but increasingly capable of threatening German positions. The human cost of this transition began to weigh on German forces in tangible ways. Casualties in the opening months of Barbarossa had been severe, but accepted as part of a campaign intended to be brief and conclusive. Summer losses had been replaced with fresh divisions and replacement personnel. But as autumn advanced and the Soviet resistance showed no sign of crumbling, replacements became less readily available. The reach of German mobilization, which seemed virtually unlimited in continental Europe, proved finite when extended to an endless frontier and grinding attrition. Frontline divisions that had achieved their victories through superior mobility and training now found themselves locked in positional warfare against numerically superior Soviet forces. The glamour of blitzkrieg, the rapid maneuver warfare that had defined German success in Poland and France, gave way to attritional fighting where German advantages in training and flexibility mattered less. German soldiers, now entering their fourth month of a campaign that was supposed to conclude in 3, began to understand that they would not be home by Christmas. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the Wehrmacht, subtly eroding the morale and confidence that had characterized the opening offensive. The relationship between Hitler and his senior commanders, already strained by the campaign's complications, began to fracture along new lines. Field marshals and army commanders who had warned of the campaign's risks found themselves vindicated by unfolding events, yet paradoxically less able to influence strategy. Hitler's response to evidence that the rapid victory was unattainable was not to reassess objectives or modify strategy, but rather to demand ever greater effort and concentration of force. The professional military judgment of German general staff officers, men trained in the careful calculation of resources and the realistic assessment of enemy strength, increasingly collided with Hitler's determination to achieve victories that political ideology demanded. German commanders understood, with the clarity that only months of combat can provide, that the Soviet Union had not been defeated, and that the Wehrmacht faced a strategic situation requiring either massive reinforcement or fundamental reassessment of objectives. Yet Hitler was unwilling to acknowledge either possibility. The campaign would continue. More offensives would be launched. Somehow, the Soviet Union would be forced to surrender. The tragedy that would unfold over the next 4 years was seeded in this autumn of 1941, when German commanders first confronted the reality that their greatest military victory might prove to be the opening chapter of their greatest military disaster. The winter that approached across the Russian steppe would make this growing recognition suddenly and brutally explicit. As temperatures fell and snow blanketed the landscape, German soldiers lacking adequate winter clothing and German vehicles freezing in their positions would experience the full consequences of an invasion that had not achieved its objectives before the season turned against the invader. The myth of German military invincibility, which had sustained the Wehrmacht through the triumphs of earlier campaigns, would suffer its first major challenge, and German commanders, forced to confront the reality that they had initiated a campaign whose conclusion remained obscure and whose costs continued to mount, would understand that Barbarossa had entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The triumph of the summer offensive was revealing itself as merely a prelude to a longer struggle whose outcome could no longer be taken for granted. The certainty that had characterized German planning and execution during those golden weeks of June and July was dissolving like morning mist. What would replace it was fear. Fear that the Wehrmacht had struck at a foe more powerful than intelligence estimates had suggested. Fear that time itself was becoming an enemy as the campaign extended beyond the window of available resources. Fear that the Soviet Union would not collapse despite everything the German army could throw against it. In this atmosphere of growing dread, masked in public by triumphant communiques yet felt acutely by every commander who understood the reality behind the propaganda, German military planners confronted autumn in 1941 with the uncomfortable knowledge that the war in Russia was not ending as intended. It was, instead, only beginning to reveal its true character. In the summer of 1941, the German High Command possessed a weapon more formidable than any armored division or fighter squadron. It was the certainty of their own invincibility. After 3 months of blitzkrieg warfare, the Wehrmacht had advanced more than 1,000 kilometers into Soviet territory, destroyed Soviet forces in the hundreds of thousands, and seemed poised to deliver the knockout blow that would end the Eastern Front before winter came. German officers spoke of reaching Moscow in weeks, not months. They spoke of final victory, but they had miscalculated something far more subtle and far more dangerous than Soviet reserves or the courage of Soviet soldiers. They had miscalculated the Russian landscape itself and the seasons that governed it. What came next would teach them that nature, indifferent to ideology and immune to tactical brilliance, could be a more merciless enemy than any human opponent. As autumn descended across Western Russia in 1941, the landscape that had favored German mobility began its transformation into something altogether different. The roads that German supply convoys relied upon, thin threads connecting the advancing armies to their distant bases, were not the paved highways of Western Europe. They were largely primitive tracts of compacted earth, utterly dependent on dry weather to remain passable. Russian roads in summer were already a nightmare for the mechanized Wehrmacht, but they were merely a prelude to what autumn would bring. The Rasputitsa, as the Russians called it, the season of mud, was not merely bad weather. It was a climatic event that reshaped the entire operational landscape. When the autumn rains came, and they came with relentless regularity, these roads did not simply become wet. They transformed into quagmires of black, adhesive mud that could swallow vehicles whole and bring entire armies to a standstill. By early October 1941, the Rasputitsa had begun its work. German supply lines, already stretched to their absolute limits, started to collapse under the weight of mud and distance. Trucks meant to carry ammunition and food found themselves mired in roads that became rivers of thick, sucking earth. A vehicle that might transport vital supplies 200 kilometers in a day on Western European roads now required days to cover a fraction of that distance, if it could move at all. The quartermaster reports from this period reveal an escalating crisis in logistics that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Panzer divisions that had swept across the steppe in summer, their armor gleaming and their crews triumphant, found themselves stationary, waiting for supplies that might take weeks to arrive. The Blitzkrieg, that doctrine of speed and surprise and overwhelming force, was predicated on momentum, and momentum, once lost to mud, became nearly impossible to regain. German mechanized warfare, so devastatingly effective against the relatively static warfare of previous campaigns, could not function in a landscape where movement itself had become the primary enemy. The soldiers in the ranks began to understand, long before their commanders, what was happening. Their letters home from this period speak of a peculiar despair that surpasses even the casualties of combat. The mud seemed to possess an almost sentient malevolence, dragging at boots, clotting to uniforms, making every forward advance feel as though they were wading through liquid earth. One German soldier described the experience in terms of exhaustion rather than fear, a deep, all-consuming fatigue that came from moving through a landscape that actively resisted movement. The motorized divisions that formed the spearhead of Barbarossa depended entirely on vehicles that required constant maintenance, even in ideal conditions. In mud that caked and hardened on engines, that froze in every crevice, that turned transmission fluid to sludge, these machines required maintenance that was nearly impossible to provide in field conditions far from workshops. The result was a steady attrition of vehicles that had nothing to do with combat, and everything to do with the simple impossibility of maintaining mechanical warfare in a landscape hostile to machines. Even as the mud threatened to paralyze the Wehrmacht, another catastrophe was already visible on the calendar. Winter was coming. The German commanders were not ignorant of the fact. They could see the weather turning colder with each passing day, could watch the sun arc lower across the sky with each sunrise. But the depth of Russian winter was something that even those who had studied maps and read historical accounts were unprepared for. The German General Staff had made calculations, as military staffs do. They had estimated that winter would arrive by late October or early November. They had considered supply requirements for cold weather operations, but they had fundamentally underestimated two things: the intensity of the cold that would come and the possibility that the campaign would still be ongoing when that cold arrived. The assumption that Moscow would fall by November made all other considerations seem academic. When Moscow did not fall, when the armies ground to a halt not 20 kilometers from the city's suburbs in December, the theoretical calculations became a desperate reality. The Russian winter, when it arrived, was not a gradual decline into cold. It was a catastrophic shift. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing in November plummeted through December to levels that seemed almost unimaginable to soldiers from Central Europe. By January, thermometers registered -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, the human body begins to betray itself almost immediately. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. The rubber of vehicle tires becomes brittle and shatters. Engine oil thickens to the consistency of tar. Steel becomes so cold that bare metal burns human flesh. The German army, mobilized in spring for a summer campaign, possessed almost no cold weather equipment. There were no winter uniforms for most troops. Greatcoats, when available, offered some protection, but were never sufficient. There were no proper cold weather boots in quantities that would have made a difference. The horses that formed a crucial part of German logistics were animals of temperate Europe, and they died by the hundreds of thousands in the Russian cold, their bodies simply freezing where they stood. The experience of German soldiers in the winter of 1941 and 1942 became a crucible that tested the limits of human endurance. The letters and diaries that survive from this period speak less of combat than of cold, less of the enemy than of the weather. Frostbite became ubiquitous, turning fingers and toes black before they fell away. Some soldiers froze while trying to sleep, their bodies simply shutting down in the face of temperatures they had no capacity to resist. Others suffered what the medical personnel called immersion foot, where the tissue died in living feet that continued to carry them forward. The psychological impact was equally profound. Men who had been assured of swift victory, who had advanced seemingly without limit through the summer and autumn, now found themselves in a landscape that seemed designed to destroy them. The snow stretched in every direction, undulating hills of white that erased the familiar landmarks of military maps. The cold was not an enemy that could be fought or overcome through courage or discipline. It simply was, and every moment outdoors was a battle against a force that did not recognize the concept of mercy. The mechanical equipment upon which the Wehrmacht depended fractured under the assault of the Russian winter. Tanks that had performed flawlessly through the summer became mechanical corpses, their engines seized, their hydraulics frozen. Trucks that were supposed to keep the armies supplied simply stopped running, their engines cracked by the cold, their lubricants congealed to uselessness. The Luftwaffe, that branch of the Wehrmacht that had dominated the skies through the summer campaign, found its aircraft immobilized by the cold. Engines that required warming fires before they could even turn over consumed fuel that was needed for operations. Fuel itself became a weapon of the cold. Diesel fuel thickened and refused to flow, while the volatility of gasoline meant that fuel stored in open containers simply evaporated in the intense cold. The mechanized warfare that had brought Germany to the threshold of Moscow became, in the Russian winter, a liability rather than an advantage. The Soviet forces, despite their own suffering from the cold, possessed equipment designed for these temperatures. Soviet engines ran when German engines had died. Soviet soldiers, though they froze like any others, came from a nation that had invested in cold weather equipment. Most crucially, the Soviet Union understood that winter was not an aberration to be overcome, but a fundamental aspect of the landscape that required preparation. What became clear to the German commanders, though many refused to fully acknowledge it, was that the logistics of a mechanized army in Russian winter were fundamentally unsustainable. The distances involved were vast beyond the capacity of wheeled transport to bridge. The cold consumed fuel at rates that logistics planners had never calculated. The mud of autumn had already crippled supply lines, but winter merely shifted the nature of the catastrophe. Snow covered the roads that mud had made impassable, which was sometimes marginally better, but never actually good. The railways that would have solved the supply problem remained unconverted to German gauge. The Soviet Union, anticipating invasion, had deliberately built their railways to a different width than German rolling stock could use. Converting these railways to German gauge was a process that consumed enormous resources and took months, and by the time the conversion began, it was already catastrophically late. The supply situation, which had been precarious since the first days of Barbarossa, became truly desperate by December 1941. The armies were fighting not merely against Soviet forces, but against a combination of exhaustion, hunger, cold, and the physical impossibility of maintaining a mechanized war across such distances in such conditions. The decision to halt the offensive and attempt a winter holding operation was made at the highest levels of German command, though it came far later than it should have. As December deepened and the temperature fell, it became apparent that the lunge for Moscow had failed, that the Wehrmacht would not achieve the swift victory that Hitler had promised, that the campaign would continue into winter. The order came from Hitler himself to hold ground, to not retreat, to stand firm before the Soviet capital. The strategic concept was sound in its way. Retreat in winter would be even more catastrophic than standing still, but the execution revealed the depths of German strategic miscalculation. The armies that held the line through the winter of 1941 and 1942 were sustained not through superior planning, but through the sheer refusal of soldiers to succumb to the cold. They dug themselves into positions that offered some shelter. They burned everything combustible to generate heat. They huddled together in the darkness of the Russian night. Casualties mounted not primarily from combat, but from cold and exposure. Some historians argue that more German soldiers died from the cold of the winter of 1941 than from all combat operations of the preceding summer and autumn combined. The victory that the German High Command had promised their troops, the swift defeat of the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, had become impossible. What had seemed certain in July had become impossible by December. The natural world had intervened with a force that no amount of military genius could overcome. The mud of autumn had arrested the blitzkrieg. The cold of winter had frozen it in place. And the vast distance of the Soviet Union had already made logistics a losing battle before the weather had even begun its assault. The Wehrmacht would recover somewhat as spring came and the earth dried. New offensives would be launched. But the certainty had been broken. The myth of invincible German mechanized warfare had been tested against nature itself and had been found wanting. What remained was a grinding, attritional war that would consume resources and lives without producing the decisive victory that alone could have justified the campaign. The German soldiers who endured that winter, who froze in the mud and the cold far from home, had lived through the moment when the Eastern Front transformed from a lightning campaign into an endless nightmare. They had lived through the moment when Hitler's gamble, already uncertain in purely military terms, became something far worse, a war that could not be won, pursued by a regime that could not admit failure. The autumn of 1941 had tested the Wehrmacht in ways its commanders never anticipated. Supply lines stretched across 1,000 kilometers of mud and devastation. Vehicles broke down in the cold. Men grew thin on inadequate rations. Yet despite these hardships, German army commanders still believed Moscow lay within reach. The city sat fewer than 100 kilometers away. Soviet forces appeared to be weakening. One final push, they told themselves, would break Stalin's will and force the Soviet Union to surrender. That belief would shatter in the frozen darkness of a Russian winter that exceeded every calculation and preparation. The Germans were about to learn that the same season that had defeated Napoleon 2 centuries earlier now awaited them. By early December 1941, temperatures began their catastrophic descent. The first frosts came in November, hard and sudden. German soldiers, accustomed to the milder winters of Western Europe, found themselves utterly unprepared for what was coming. The High Command had planned for a swift victory by autumn, and winter clothing had never been manufactured in sufficient quantity. Men wore summer uniforms beneath thin overcoats designed for the Rhine Valley, not the Russian steppe. Machine guns froze solid. Engine oil turned to sludge. Gasoline became like treacle in the tanks of trucks and tanks. The very mechanisms of modern warfare began to fail as temperatures plummeted toward -30 and then -40 degrees Celsius. Winter had arrived not as an inconvenience, but as an executioner. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched by Marshal Georgy Zhukov in early December, struck with perfect timing. As German soldiers shivered in their inadequate clothing and huddled around fires they were forbidden to light by discipline-obsessed officers, Soviet forces descended upon them in coordinated attacks. The Red Army, trained and equipped for winter warfare, moved with confidence, while German units struggled simply to function. Entire divisions that had seemed invincible in summer now found themselves pushed backward, surrendering territory kilometer by kilometer. Soldiers could barely feel their fingers to operate rifles. Frostbite claimed victims as quickly as enemy bullets. Men died not from wounds but from exposure, collapsing into snowdrifts and never waking. The myth of German military invincibility, cultivated through 2 years of victories, began to crack like ice beneath boots. The situation before Moscow deteriorated with alarming speed through December 1941. German panzer units, the spearhead of the entire invasion, ground to a halt as mechanical failure joined human exhaustion. Tanks that had rolled through France now sat immobilized in vast white fields. Senior commanders, men like Field Marshal Günther von Kluge and General Adolf Strauss, submitted urgent requests to Hitler for permission to consolidate positions, establish a winter line, and await reinforcements. They understood that attempting to continue the offensive in such conditions was suicide. The Wehrmacht needed time to reorganize, to gather proper winter equipment, to restore supply lines and repair its broken vehicles. Retreat, even tactical retreat, offered the only rational option. But Hitler, commanding from his distant headquarters in East Prussia, refused to listen. The very word retreat was anathema to him. He had never retreated from anything. On the 6th of December, as the first major blizzard of winter swept across the German positions, Hitler issued his first categorical orders forbidding any withdrawal. Generals received radioed commands to stand in place, to hold every meter of ground, to resist to the last man if necessary. The concept of defensive positions, fortified lines, prepared fallback locations, these were swept aside by Hitler's will. To withdraw was to admit failure. To admit failure was to acknowledge that the Führer's judgment had been faulty. That was unthinkable. So instead, orders went out to frontline units. Hold, defend, counterattack if possible. Surrender your positions to the Red Army only when you have breathed your last. The men receiving these orders were not fanatics willing to die for ideology. They were soldiers, many conscripted, many drafted from conquered territories, who wanted to survive the winter and return home. They were forced instead to stand frozen in positions they could not retreat from, under orders they could not disobey. The human crisis deepened with each passing day. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, spread across defensive positions from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, faced a choice between obedience and self-preservation. Medical officers reported cases of frostbite by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Soldiers wrapped newspapers around their legs beneath their uniforms, searching for any additional insulation. They burned villages for warmth, then burned railway ties, then the wooden structures of captured Soviet towns. Officers caught men attempting to desert and executed them as examples. Hunger compounded the suffering. Rations, stretched thin by logistics failures, provided barely enough calories to maintain strength in temperate conditions. In -40-degree weather, men needed thousands of additional calories simply to generate body heat. Few received them. Instead, they starved slowly while freezing, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue as fuel. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical ordeal. Men who had been trained as conquering soldiers found themselves besieged by an enemy they could not see and could not defeat, the Russian winter itself. Letters home, intercepted and preserved by intelligence services, reveal a picture of increasing despair. Soldiers wrote of comrades frozen to death in their sleep, still upright in their trenches. They described the sound of frostbite, the crackling of ice crystals forming in human tissue, the screams of men realizing their fingers and toes were dead. Some wrote of a numbness beyond the physical cold, a resignation to death that made the endless suffering bearable only by ceasing to feel anything at all. The Wehrmacht, an army of men shaped by pride and confidence, was being broken not by superior tactics or strategy, but by cold and hunger, and the terrible realization that they had been sent into hell on the orders of a man who did not understand what he was asking them to endure. Soviet forces, moving forward through the same winter that tormented German soldiers, did so with equipment and preparation designed for such conditions. They wore quilted winter jackets, felt-lined boots, goggles against the snow glare. Soviet officers had grown up in climates like this. Their vehicles, their horses, even their tactics were adapted to deep snow and bitter cold. Where German tanks became immobilized, Soviet T-34 tanks, with wider tracks and different engine designs, continued to move. Where German soldiers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, Soviet troops advanced in coordinated formations behind artillery that had learned to function in extreme cold. The contrast was stark. The same winter that was killing the Wehrmacht was merely making the Red Army uncomfortable. It was an advantage, and Soviet commanders exploited it mercilessly. Yet even as German forces retreated under Soviet pressure and the weight of their own suffering, Hitler remained unmoved. Field Marshal Heinz Guderian, commander of the Second Panzer Army, flew to Hitler's headquarters in person, desperate to explain the reality of conditions at the front. Soldiers were dying of cold, he reported. Equipment was failing. Supply lines were breaking. The army needed either reinforcements and equipment or permission to establish defensive positions and consolidate strength. Hitler listened, unmoved, and issued instructions to hold. Guderian departed in shock. Later, he would write that he had tried to speak to Hitler as one soldier to another, man to man, and had failed. The Führer would not acknowledge that his invasion had failed in its primary objective. To admit that would be to shatter the narrative of his own genius that he had constructed. So he ordered men to die rather than admit error. By mid-December 1941, the German advance had halted entirely. More than that, it was reversing. Soviet counteroffensives pushed units back from their farthest advances. The Wehrmacht fell back 50 kilometers, then 100 kilometers from Moscow. The city that was supposed to fall in summer remained unconquered as winter deepened. German commanders filed reports documenting the disaster. Casualties were astronomical. equipment was destroyed, morale was collapsing. Replacements, few and undertrained, arrived at the front and died within days. The losses were unsustainable. The situation was hopeless. Yet still, orders came down the chain of command. Hold position, defend to the death, retreat only when there is no one left to retreat. The winter of 1941 and 1942 became the crucible in which the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was forged into something else, proof of its human limitations. 4 million German soldiers had invaded the Soviet Union. By the end of that winter, more than 2 million had been killed, wounded, or frozen to death. The Luftwaffe, which had ruled the skies of Europe, had suffered such losses in its winter campaign that it would never recover air superiority. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, the machines of war that had conquered France, lay scattered across the Russian steppe as wreckage and rust. Most devastating of all was the realization that this was not the end. The war would continue. The Soviet Union had not surrendered. The Americans had entered the war after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Germany faced not a swift victory, but a war on multiple fronts that it could not win. The first winter crisis had not resolved Barbarossa. It had only begun a slow catastrophe that would consume the entire German nation. As the snow fell deeper and the cold grew more bitter, thousands of German soldiers faced the choice between obedience and survival. Some deserted, accepting the likelihood of execution over the certainty of death by freezing. Others held their positions and died as ordered, their bodies preserved in the permafrost like monuments to a failed strategy. Hitler, secure in his East Prussian headquarters with its heating and its sufficient food, issued more orders. Hold, defend, do not retreat. The men in the trenches, their fingers blackened by frostbite, their uniforms rotting from filth and snow, heard those orders transmitted down the chain of command, and many of them obeyed, choosing a soldier's death to desertion's disgrace. The winter had transformed everything. The invincible Wehrmacht became a force locked in a grinding struggle with an enemy it could not defeat. The myth of swift victory became a memory. The reality of endless war stretched forward into a future that held only suffering. The winter of 1941 had shattered more than German supply lines and soldier morale. It had shattered something far more dangerous, the mythology of inevitable German victory. For months, Hitler had staked everything on a single premise: that the Soviet Union could be destroyed in a summer campaign, that Soviet reserves were exhausted, that one more push would break the enemy entirely. The Russian winter had proven him wrong, and Soviet counteroffensives had pushed German armies back from the gates of Moscow itself. Yet rather than recalibrate, rather than accept that Operation Barbarossa had failed in its strategic objective, Hitler chose a different path. He would not retreat. He would not consolidate. Instead, he would double down, pouring fresh formations into the furnace of the Eastern Front and launching an entirely new offensive aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. This decision, born from desperation masked as determination, would transform the Wehrmacht into a force slowly grinding itself to powder against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. The strategic logic, on its surface, appeared rational. Germany desperately needed oil. The Caucasian oil fields, far to the south, represented both a solution to Germany's fuel crisis and a potential knockout blow to Soviet war production. If German armies could capture the Caucasus, the argument went, they would secure the resources necessary to continue the war while simultaneously cutting off Soviet oil supplies. The Soviet Union would collapse from within, starved of the fuel necessary to power its increasingly mechanized armies. It was an elegant theory, one that appealed to Hitler's gambler's instinct. In reality, it was a theory untethered from the material realities of modern warfare. The distances involved were staggering. The supply lines, already stretched across hundreds of kilometers of devastated terrain, would have to extend even further south. The Soviet forces, far from being exhausted and ready to fold, had demonstrated at Moscow that they could mount coordinated counterattacks. And the men, the officers, the tanks, the aircraft required for this new offensive existed in quantities far below what the German General Staff knew was necessary. Yet Hitler ordered the offensive, and the Wehrmacht, bound by oath and military discipline and the crushing weight of dictatorship, prepared to execute it. The offensive, designated Operation Blau, began in late June 1942, roughly a year after Barbarossa's initial launch. German armies, primarily the 4th Panzer Army and the 6th Army under the command of Friedrich Paulus, struck southeastward from the Ukrainian territory they had conquered the previous summer. The immediate objective was to seize the Don River crossings and push toward the Caucasus. In the opening weeks, the offensive achieved remarkable success, reminiscent of the glory days of 1941. German panzer formations, still operating at high efficiency despite their losses, sliced through Soviet defensive lines. Soviet reserves, hastily moved into position, were shattered by German armor and air power. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. German commanders reported victories in terms of square kilometers conquered and enemy formations destroyed. For a brief moment, the old certainties seemed to return. Perhaps, the thinking went, the gamble would work after all. Perhaps the summer of 1942 would deliver what the summer of 1941 had failed to provide. But as June turned to July, and July to August, the reality of attrition began to reassert itself. The further south German armies advanced, the longer their supply lines became, and the more precarious their supply situation grew. Soviet resistance, rather than collapsing, stiffened. New formations appeared in the field, seemingly materialized from nowhere. Soviet commanders, learning from the catastrophes of 1941, distributed their reserves more skillfully and coordinated their withdrawals more effectively. The Germans were not advancing into a vacuum, but into an enemy that, though battered, remained formidable. More importantly, the Germans discovered that occupying territory and defeating armies on the field were not the same as winning a war. Vast regions of southern Russia, captured and held at tremendous cost, produced little of value. The oil fields at the Caucasus remained tantalizingly out of reach, requiring advances of hundreds of kilometers through terrain that became increasingly difficult to supply. The Soviet forces, rather than collapsing, were conducting a deliberate withdrawal, trading space for time, stretching German supply lines to the breaking point, while their own reserves accumulated behind the front lines. By August 1942, the focal point of the campaign had shifted to a city that would come to symbolize the entire nature of this grinding, attrition-based war: Stalingrad. Originally, Stalingrad held no particular strategic importance in German planning. It was a Soviet industrial city on the Volga River, lying along the axis of German advance toward the Caucasus. But Stalin, viewing the city as a test of Soviet will and resolved to hold it against any German assault, committed enormous reserves to its defense. Hitler, interpreting Stalingrad as the key to southern Russia, became obsessed with its capture. Thus began one of history's most brutal urban struggles, fought in factories and apartment blocks, in rubble and flame, for months on end. The battle would consume hundreds of thousands of soldiers from both sides. Entire German divisions would be committed to street fighting for which they were neither trained nor equipped. Soviet formations would mount counterattacks through blizzards and smoke, and through it all, the grinding nature of attrition would accelerate, consuming men and machines at rates that no industrial production could sustain indefinitely. Yet even as German forces threw themselves at Stalingrad's defences, the Wehrmacht was engaged in similar struggles across the entire southern front. The advance toward the Caucasus had stalled along the Don River, where German formations found themselves increasingly unable to break through Soviet defensive lines. Smaller offensives, tactical in nature, achieved local victories but failed to break Soviet resistance fundamentally. Each offensive required the commitment of reserves that could not be replaced. Each tactical victory cost more men and machines than the previous one, and each month that passed saw Soviet forces grow stronger, not weaker. Fresh divisions continued to arrive from the depths of Soviet territory. New T-34 tanks rolled off Soviet assembly lines at rates that German industry could not match. Soviet pilots, learning from their losses and flying increasingly sophisticated aircraft, contested German air superiority in ways they had not in 1941. The fundamental problem at the heart of Operation Blau, that Germany lacked the resources to sustain a massive offensive war across continental distances against an enemy with deeper reserves, remained unaddressed and unresolvable. Hitler, however, refused to acknowledge this reality. In his mind, German armies simply needed to push harder, advance further, commit more men and machines. The enemy, in his estimation, must be near to breaking. One more offensive, one more concentrated effort would shatter Soviet will and deliver victory. This conviction, this refusal to accept material limits, became the defining characteristic of German strategy in 1942 and beyond. It was not the thinking of a rational military planner weighing resources against objectives. It was the thinking of a man increasingly unmoored from reality, convinced of his own infallibility, surrounded by subordinates too frightened to contradict him directly. As a result, formations that had been shattered and reconstituted were shattered again. Divisions that had suffered massive casualties were committed to new offensives without receiving adequate replacements. Panzer units that had been reduced to half strength were thrown into attacks requiring their full combat power. The Wehrmacht was living on borrowed time, and that time was running out. The human cost of this strategy manifested itself across the entire Eastern Front, but nowhere more visibly than in the slow grinding forward of the Sixth Army towards Stalingrad and beyond. Under Paulus, the Sixth Army advanced southeastward through the summer of 1942, its strength slowly eroded by constant fighting, exposure, supply shortages, and the accumulating psychological burden of endless combat. The soldiers, many of them veterans of Barbarossa's opening campaigns, began to understand with a clarity their commanders often lacked that something had changed. The Soviet enemy was not collapsing. The logistics were not improving. The promised breakthrough to the Caucasus was not materializing. Instead, there was only the endless advance, the constant casualties, the replacement of lost men with undertrained conscripts, and the deepening sense that they were being slowly consumed by a war that had already been lost in strategic terms. Yet the orders came to advance, and the men obeyed, because that was the nature of the Wehrmacht in the era of Nazi command authority. Questioning orders was impossible. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was dishonorable. The only path forward was to advance, to fight, to die if necessary. By autumn 1942, the true catastrophe of this strategy had begun to become visible, though many in the German high command remained blind to it. The Wehrmacht had not captured the Caucasus, The Soviet oil fields remained in Soviet hands. The Great Encirclements of 1941, those spectacular double envelopments that had seemed to promise swift Soviet collapse, could not be repeated. Instead, German armies found themselves stretched across vast territories, holding positions they could not afford to hold, facing enemies that appeared to grow stronger with each passing month. The supply situation, already dire, deteriorated further. Trucks broke down on primitive roads and could not be repaired. Horses, essential for moving supplies across terrain where roads had disappeared entirely, died of starvation and exposure. Ammunition ran short. Fuel ran short. Food rations, already minimal, were cut further. The German army, for all its tactical skill and equipment quality, was not designed to sustain a war of indefinite attrition against a numerically superior enemy with larger reserves. It was designed to win quickly or not at all. The decision to commit the Wehrmacht to the Stalingrad campaign in the autumn of 1942 represented the culmination of this strategic delusion. Rather than consolidate his gains or adopt a defensive posture that might have allowed Germany to regroup and rebuild, Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to assault the city with the objective of capturing it entirely. The fighting that followed would be unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced before. German soldiers, trained in maneuver and rapid exploitation, found themselves bogged down in urban combat, fighting from building to building, losing the mobility and firepower advantages they had enjoyed in open terrain. Soviet forces, defending their homeland in their own cities, fought with a desperation and determination that was difficult to match. By November, German forces had captured roughly 90% of the city, yet Soviet forces clung to positions in the rubble, drawing German formations deeper into the urban maze. And then, in a moment that would change the entire character of the Eastern Front, Soviet armies attacked not at Stalingrad, but to the north and south of the city, striking the flanks of the German position with overwhelming force. The results would take weeks to fully develop, but in that moment, the attrition strategy that had driven German operations since the spring of 1942 reached its logical conclusion. The Sixth Army, extended and overcommitted, found itself surrounded. The breakthrough to the Caucasus, which had seemed possible in summer, vanished entirely. What had appeared to be a brilliant offensive campaign in June and July revealed itself by December to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Yet the offensive had not failed because German generals were incompetent. Many of them, including Paulus himself, understood the risks and the material limitations. The offensive had failed because Hitler, the supreme commander, possessed neither the knowledge nor the temperament to acknowledge reality. He could not accept that the war could not be won through will and offensive spirit alone, that material resources and geographic realities imposed hard limits on what military force could achieve. As a result, the Wehrmacht would continue to assault Soviet positions, continue to drive men into battle, continue to commit its remaining reserves for another year and more. And with each offensive, with each tactical victory that changed nothing strategically, the German army would inch closer to its own destruction. This was the nature of the 1942 offensives and of the entire German strategy that followed. Not a rational plan, but a series of desperate gambles, each predicated on the belief that one more offensive, one more commitment of men and machines would finally break Soviet resistance. In reality, each offensive drained German reserves that could never be replaced. Each month of continued offensive operations consumed ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and most importantly, soldiers that the German military production system could not generate fast enough to sustain. The Soviets, by contrast, were learning to wage war. Their commanders were becoming more skilled, their industry was expanding, their reserves, far from being exhausted, appeared to be endless. The fundamental imbalance of the war, the great truth that Hitler had refused to acknowledge when he launched Barbarossa, was now becoming impossible to deny. Germany had set itself against an enemy with superior manpower, superior resources, and superior strategic depth. No amount of tactical brilliance, no series of lightning offensives could overcome that fundamental disadvantage. The summer of 1942 had offered one last opportunity for stalemate, for consolidation, perhaps even for negotiation from a position of strength. Hitler's decision to continue the offensive, to launch Operation Blau, to commit the Sixth Army to Stalingrad, had instead transformed a failed conquest into a slow, grinding defeat that would consume millions of lives and reshape the entire course of European history. In the summer of 1942, Hitler shifted his gaze southward. The initial blitzkrieg across western Russia had stalled. Moscow remained unconquered. Winter had broken the Wehrmacht's momentum. And so, seeking vindication through a new offensive, Hitler ordered his armies toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, a region he believed would yield the fuel and resources Germany desperately needed to continue the war. But standing in the way of this ambition lay a city that would become, for both nations, a test of will that transcended military calculation. Its name was Stalingrad, and it would reshape the entire Eastern Front. Stalingrad in 1942 was a sprawling industrial city of roughly 600,000 people, stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. Its steel mills, factories, and refineries represented Soviet industrial might. For Hitler, the city held strategic value as a gateway to the southern oil reserves. But beyond strategy, the city's name itself, named after Stalin, transformed it into something more than a military objective. For both Hitler and Stalin, Stalingrad became a question of prestige, of will, of who would break first. What began as a military campaign would evolve into something closer to mutual annihilation. The city would become a furnace in which the Wehrmacht's invincibility would burn away. German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, numbered roughly 250,000 men when it reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August 1942. Paulus was a career officer of considerable skill, but he would find that tactical brilliance meant little in the grinding nightmare about to unfold. The city itself became the battlefield, not open terrain where panzer divisions could maneuver, but a labyrinth of rubble, factories, and apartment blocks where firepower and courage mattered more than mechanized sophistication. As German forces pushed into the city from the west, Soviet defenders dug in, block by block, factory by factory. The fighting would consume the city methodically, brutally, and without mercy. The Luftwaffe initially held air superiority over Stalingrad, and German bombers reduced much of the city to ruins even before ground forces entered. Civilian infrastructure crumbled under constant bombardment. Yet these ruins became defensive assets for the Soviets. Every collapsed building, every destroyed factory, every rubble-choked street became a fighting position, a strong point from which defenders could hold German attackers at bay. Soviet commander Alexander Rodimtsev led the 64th Army across the Volga in early September, ferrying troops by barge under constant fire to reinforce the city's desperate defenders. The Soviet forces, supplied only through the narrow corridor of the Volga, fought with the knowledge that retreat meant death, not from bullets, but from blocking detachments that prevented unauthorized withdrawal. House-to-house fighting defined the battle as September turned to October. German soldiers, trained in open warfare and mechanized maneuver, found themselves in close-quarters combat they had not anticipated and for which they were not fully prepared. Soviet defenders, often conscripted factory workers and party members, fought with fanatical determination born partly from propaganda and partly from the understanding that surrender meant execution. The famous Pavlov House, a single apartment building held by a squad of Soviet defenders, became a symbol of Soviet resistance. For more than 2 months, Soviet troops under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov held this position against repeated German assaults, each attack breaking against their firepower like waves against rock. Across Stalingrad, similar scenes of desperate defiance played out in factories, schoolhouses, and administrative buildings. The tempo of the battle was relentless but slow. German forces, despite their technological advantages, measured progress in meters rather than kilometers. In the factory district, particularly at the massive Red October steelworks, German and Soviet forces fought through September and October in a maze of furnaces, workshops, and storage areas where tanks and heavy weapons were nearly useless. Soviet snipers, including the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, claimed hundreds of German lives from carefully concealed positions among the ruins. The psychological toll on German soldiers mounted steadily as they realized this was not the swift victory Hitler had promised. Winter was approaching. Supply lines were stretched thin, and the city, far from falling, seemed to only grow more defiant. Stalin, watching from Moscow with cold fury, refused permission for any withdrawal. He understood the propaganda value of Stalingrad's name, and he weaponized it mercilessly. Soviet soldiers received harsh orders, not one step backward. Blocking detachments, armed with submachine guns, positioned themselves behind Soviet lines to prevent retreat. Officers who requested withdrawal were court-martialed. The Soviet Union, too, was sacrificing its sons on an altar of ideology and pride. By November, both nations were locked in a struggle neither could abandon without losing face. The city had become a test not merely of military capacity but of national will, a measurement of whose soldiers would endure, whose system would demand more sacrifice, and who would ultimately prove unbreakable. What neither Hitler nor Stalin fully grasped in November 1942 was that Soviet reinforcements were gathering far beyond the Volga. Soviet General Alexander Vasilevsky had orchestrated the assembly of fresh armies in preparation for a massive counteroffensive, designed not merely to relieve Stalingrad, but to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army entirely. German intelligence, stretched thin across vast distances, did not detect the scope of these preparations. German commanders, exhausted by months of urban fighting and depleted by casualties, urged Hitler to authorize withdrawal before Soviet forces completed their encirclement. But Hitler refused. He ordered the Sixth Army to stand and fight. The order, communicated through General Paulus, condemned hundreds of thousands of men to a fate none of them could yet fully comprehend. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. Across the steppes north and south of Stalingrad, roughly 1 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, attacked German and Romanian positions holding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. The Romanian armies, lacking armor and air support, collapsed under the onslaught. German relief forces, hastily assembled and undermanned, could not restore the line. Within 4 days, Soviet mechanized columns completed a massive encirclement, trapping the Sixth Army and portions of the Fourth Panzer Army within a shrinking perimeter. Roughly 300,000 German and Allied troops found themselves surrounded, with no realistic prospect of breakthrough and with supply lines severed. The furnace had become a trap. General Paulus, receiving Hitler's orders to stand fast and await relief, complied, even as his officers pleaded for authorization to attempt a breakout while a narrow corridor still existed. Paulus was a soldier who followed orders, and the orders from Berlin were unmistakable. The Sixth Army would not surrender. German relief attempts, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, failed repeatedly through December 1942 and January 1943. The German Sixth Army, starving and freezing in the ruins of Stalingrad, was condemned to an agonizing death by attrition. Soviet forces gradually compressed the perimeter, factory by factory, building by building. German soldiers, reduced to eating horseflesh and then leather and bark, fought on because the alternative was court-martial or execution by their own blocking detachments, or summary judgment by SS officers embedded with the army. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army controlled only the central ruins of Stalingrad, a pocket measuring roughly 8 kilometers by 4 kilometers. Starvation was as deadly as Soviet bullets. German hospitals overflowed with wounded, who would receive no treatment beyond morphine injections and quiet death. Paulus, his authority crumbling and his moral position becoming untenable, sought permission from Hitler to authorize surrender to spare the remaining soldiers from pointless slaughter. Hitler's response was characteristically unforgiving. The Sixth Army would fight to the last man. Surrender was not an option. On January 31, 1943, with Soviet soldiers closing in on his command post, General Paulus chose surrender over suicide. The remaining German forces, reduced to roughly 91,000 men from an original force of nearly 300,000, laid down their arms. The casualties at Stalingrad transformed the battle into something beyond mere military defeat. The Sixth Army suffered approximately 190,000 killed in action, or died from wounds and exposure. Roughly 30,000 more were captured. Of the German prisoners marched into Soviet captivity, the majority would not survive the journey or the subsequent years of imprisonment. Soviet casualties were staggering as well, somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 killed or missing, depending on the accounting. The city itself, once a center of Soviet industry and urban culture, lay in ruins, its factories destroyed, its infrastructure obliterated, its civilian population decimated by war, starvation, and ideology. Stalingrad, the symbol of Soviet defiance, had become a graveyard. For Hitler, Stalingrad represented the shattering of illusion. He had believed the Wehrmacht invincible, Soviet forces brittle, and German will supreme. Stalingrad proved otherwise. The defeat punctured the myth of Nazi military superiority and demonstrated that the Soviet Union, far from collapsing, could absorb catastrophic losses and counter with overwhelming force. For Stalin, despite the staggering Soviet casualties and destruction, Stalingrad validated the ruthless application of will and resources. Both leaders had demanded the maximum sacrifice from their soldiers, and both had received it. But only Stalin's system had been vindicated by the outcome. The strategic initiative, which had passed to Germany at the war's beginning, now passed permanently to the Soviet Union. From Stalingrad forward, the Wehrmacht would fight only to delay its eventual defeat, never again to achieve strategic victory. The furnace had consumed the dream of German conquest, and in its ashes lay the seeds of Soviet dominance that would shape Europe for the next 50 years. In the spring of 1943, on the steppes of southern Russia, a geographic peculiarity presented itself to German military planners with what seemed like a gift from Providence. The Red Army had pushed forward so aggressively after its winter victories that its front lines had bulged outward into a massive salient, a deep pocket of territory jutting westward into German-controlled land. This bulge, centered on the city of Kursk, appeared to German high command as an opportunity almost too obvious to pass up. If German forces could strike inward from north and south simultaneously, they could envelop the Soviet armies within the salient and destroy them in a colossal encirclement. German planners named the operation Unternehmen Zitadelle, or Operation Citadel, and convinced themselves that eliminating this salient would restore German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front and perhaps turn the entire war in their favor. The plan was logical, focused, and represented their best hope of breaking out of the grinding stalemate that had consumed the Wehrmacht since the winter crisis before Moscow. Yet from the moment the decision was made, the operation was haunted by a fatal flaw that no amount of planning could overcome. The Soviet Union knew about it. Soviet intelligence networks had penetrated German military planning with a depth and sophistication that German commanders scarcely comprehended. The intelligence service known as the GRU, coupled with an extraordinarily effective network of civilian informants within German industry and diplomatic circles, delivered precise details of German intentions weeks before the offensive could begin. A German deserter provided warning. Soviet agents in Switzerland intercepted German communications, and even Soviet reconnaissance planes penetrated German airspace to photograph German assembly areas and confirm that the intelligence was accurate. Stalin, who had been burned badly by his underestimation of Barbarossa, was now hypersensitive to German intentions, and his commanders had learned to trust their intelligence assessments. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the brilliant and ruthless commander who had risen through the chaos of the early war to become Stalin's chief strategist, received this intelligence and immediately grasped its significance. Zhukov understood that the Germans were about to launch their last serious attempt to seize the strategic initiative, and he also understood that if the Red Army could defeat this offensive decisively, the Germans would never recover the ability to mount another strategic offensive in the east. The Red Army began its preparations with the knowledge of exactly where and when the Germans would strike. The Soviet response was methodical, overwhelming, and demonstrated how thoroughly the Red Army had transformed since the catastrophic opening months of Barbarossa. Rather than allowing the salient to remain a vulnerability, Soviet commanders began fortifying it as never before. Multiple defensive lines were constructed in depth across the expected axes of German advance, with anti-tank ditches, minefields layered so thickly that German sappers would spend hours clearing them, and concrete fortifications sited to create overlapping fields of fire. The numbers were staggering. Soviet engineers constructed more than 5,000 kilometers of anti-tank ditches, planted more than 500,000 mines, and prepared defensive positions so elaborate that even today, decades after the battle, farmers in the Kursk region still occasionally unearth unexploded ordnance buried in the earth. Soviet commanders positioned mechanized reserves behind these defensive lines, organized into multiple echelons so that if German breakthrough forces punched through the first defensive line, they would encounter fresh reserves waiting to seal the breach. The Red Army's commitment to defeating Citadel was reflected in the sheer quantity of forces committed to the battle. Over 1 million Soviet troops concentrated in the Kursk salient, supported by more than 19,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and backed by more than 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Every aspect of Soviet strategy reflected the hard lessons learned through 2 years of brutal warfare. Defense in depth, layered reserves, and the coordination of armor, artillery, and infantry to create a unified defensive system that German tactical brilliance could not overcome. The German plan itself, while strategically sound in its conception, was hobbled by the very delays that the Soviet intelligence warnings had caused. German planners, in their obsessive pursuit of perfection and their conviction that just one more new wonder weapon would transform the campaign, postponed the operation repeatedly throughout the spring of 1943. Delay after delay allowed more Soviet defensive preparations to be completed, allowed more Soviet reserves to be assembled, and allowed more time for the Red Army to prepare its own counter-offensive plans. The Wehrmacht had requested new tanks to tip the scales in its favor, and factories worked overtime to produce the Panther and Tiger tanks, which were heavier and more powerfully gunned than the Soviet T-34. German commanders also accumulated assault guns and tank destroyers, convinced that the sheer firepower of these new machines would shatter Soviet defenses. But every week of delay meant more German soldiers moved into position, more supplies consumed, more vehicles subjected to the grinding wear and tear of the steppes. The German economy, already stretched to the breaking point by years of total war, could not sustain indefinite postponement. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the finest operational commanders the Wehrmacht produced, urged Hitler to launch the offensive before the delays became catastrophic. But other generals counseled for more time, more preparations, more of everything. Hitler, displaying the instability that increasingly characterized his decision-making, vacillated between the two positions, ultimately ordering the offensive to begin in the first week of July, by which time German intelligence had become aware that the Red Army was far more prepared than previously believed. On the 5th of July 1943, German panzer divisions began rolling forward across the Russian steppe toward what they believed would be a decisive victory. In the north, Army Group Center, under General Walter Model, pushed southward from positions around Orel, aimed at driving through Soviet defenses toward Kursk. In the south, Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group South attacked northward, attempting to cut through Soviet-held territory and link up with Model's forces to trap Soviet armies in the salient. The opening hours of the assault demonstrated the terrifying power of German armored warfare at its best. Panzer units moved with precision, infantry supported the advance with disciplined aggression, and German air units fought for local air superiority against Soviet fighters. Yet from the very first day, German commanders discovered that this offensive would be radically different from earlier operations. Instead of shattering through Soviet frontline positions within hours or days, German armor encountered defensive lines so densely packed with anti-tank guns and mines that every kilometer of advance came at significant cost. Soviet aircraft, having learned not to contest German air superiority directly, instead attacked German supply columns and concentrations of vehicles moving up to the front. German tanks, for all their mechanical superiority and crew experience, could not simply bypass Soviet defensive positions as they had done in earlier campaigns. The defensive depth meant that eliminating one line of Soviet positions only revealed another layer of fortifications behind it. The first major test came within days, as German panzer spearheads made contact with Soviet mechanized reserves positioned behind the defensive lines. Unlike the Soviet armies of 1941 that had been shattered by German breakthrough tactics, these Soviet mechanized corps were commanded by experienced officers, equipped with the excellent T-34 tank and self-propelled guns, and organized to meet precisely the kind of breakthrough that German armor was attempting. When German tanks broke through Soviet frontline positions and encountered Soviet mechanized reserves, the resulting battles became massive armor engagements that consumed hundreds of tanks on both sides. At Ponyri, at Oboyan, and at a dozen other villages whose names would have meant nothing to anyone before the battle, but would become synonymous with armored warfare, tanks grappled with one another across the rolling terrain. German tank crews, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, initially held advantages in marksmanship and tactical coordination, but they could not sustain those advantages when confronted by an endless stream of Soviet reserves. The mathematics of the battle began to work against Germany from the very first week. German tanks destroyed Soviet vehicles in impressive numbers, but Soviet factories were producing replacements at a rate that German industry could not match. For every German panzer lost, 2 Soviet tanks were built to replace it. For every German soldier killed, Soviet manpower reserves, though increasingly thin, still provided replacements. By the middle of July, a little more than a week after the offensive had begun, German commanders on both the northern and southern fronts began to recognize that the operation was failing to achieve its objectives. Von Manstein's Army Group South, despite some of the fiercest fighting of the war, was making agonizingly slow progress, and the salient had not been pinched off as planned. Model's Army Group Center in the north was even worse off, making minimal territorial gains against increasingly determined Soviet resistance. Worse still, Soviet intelligence about German movements was so precise that Soviet reserves were consistently positioned to block German breakthroughs before they could develop into true operational success. Stalin, whose confidence in Zhukov's judgment had grown immensely, approved the activation of several major Soviet counteroffensive operations that were already prepared and waiting in reserve. As German forces were still grinding forward against Soviet defensive lines, Soviet armies to the north and south of the Kursk salient began their own offensives, intended to shatter German positions in adjacent sectors and force the Wehrmacht to abandon the citadel operation in order to contain new threats to its flanks and rear. The Germans, who had initiated the battle expecting to dominate it through superior tactical movement and firepower, found themselves increasingly on the defensive as Soviet operational art turned the battle against them. By the end of July, barely 3 weeks after the operation had begun, Hitler made the decision to halt the offensive and redirect German forces to meet the new Soviet threats. The official reasoning was militarily sound, continuing to batter at the Kursk salient while Soviet armies broke through in adjacent sectors made no strategic sense. But the reality was that Operation Citadel had failed in its fundamental objective. The Soviet salient still existed, Soviet armies still held the crucial territory, and German forces were not substantially stronger than they had been before the offensive began. More importantly, the psychological impact on German commanders was profound. Von Manstein, looking back on the battle, recognized that it represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. German forces had possessed what they believed to be absolute superiority in armor quality and in operational planning. They had launched the offensive with confidence that their tactical skill would overcome Soviet numerical advantages. Yet despite all their advantages, despite the quality of their tanks and the skill of their troops, they had been unable to break Soviet resistance or achieve a decisive victory. The Wehrmacht had thrown everything into the Kursk battle that could be spared from other fronts, and when that everything proved insufficient, German commanders understood with crushing clarity that they faced an opponent with seemingly limitless reserves of manpower and material, an opponent whose military competence had grown tremendously since the dark days of 1941 and 1942. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides, though the casualty figures reflected the different natures of German and Soviet losses. German forces sustained more than 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded or missing, in the brief weeks of the operation. These losses, while not catastrophic compared to some battles, were losses that German industry and manpower simply could not replace with any hope of maintaining German military strength. The Luftwaffe lost thousands of aircraft and experienced pilots in the battle, further eroding its already diminished air power. Soviet losses were higher in absolute numbers, perhaps exceeding 200,000 casualties, but Soviet losses in personnel were replaceable in a way German losses could not be, and Soviet losses in equipment were made good by industrial production that continued to accelerate as the war progressed. More importantly, Soviet losses were being sustained in the context of continuous territorial gain. With each German retreat from new defensive lines, Soviet forces moved forward, liberating occupied territory and reducing the scope of the theatre in which they had to fight. German losses, by contrast, were being sustained while losing territory, a combination that made each casualty feel like a failure rather than a step toward ultimate victory. The strategic consequences of the failure at Kursk extended far beyond the immediate military situation on the Eastern Front. The offensive had consumed vast quantities of fuel and ammunition at a time when German industry was increasingly unable to sustain such consumption. The wear and tear on German vehicles, particularly the new heavy tanks that had been introduced for the operation, proved to exceed expectations, and the damage to German logistics was more severe than the mere loss of vehicles suggested. German forces would spend the remainder of 1943 consolidating their positions and attempting to maintain their hold on conquered territory, while the Soviet Union built up strength for new offensives. The initiative in the war, which had briefly seemed to swing toward Germany in the wake of the victory at Stalingrad in February, definitively passed to the Soviet Union after Kursk. The Red Army would retain that initiative, would build upon it with successive offensives, and would press German forces relentlessly backward across the steppes toward Germany itself. No German general held any illusions after Kursk that Germany could win the war in the east. The only question that remained was how long the Wehrmacht could continue to resist, how much territory could be yielded, and whether Germany could stabilize a new defensive line somewhere west of the current positions. The Soviet counteroffensive operations that had begun while Kursk was still raging continued throughout the remainder of the summer and into the autumn of 1943. Soviet forces pushed German armies back across the Dnieper River, liberating Kiev in November and continuing to press westward. German commanders, desperate to restore some semblance of stability to the front, attempted tactical counterattacks that occasionally achieved local success but could not reverse the overall trend toward German retreat. The Wehrmacht, for all its remaining capabilities and the skill of its officers, had become essentially reactive, responding to Soviet initiatives rather than seizing the strategic initiative itself. German forces that had once dreamed of reaching the Urals and destroying Soviet power forever now fought desperately to maintain defensible positions in Ukraine and southern Russia, positions that they would ultimately be forced to abandon. The transformation was complete. The Wehrmacht had evolved from the master of the Eastern Front to merely its most skilled patient, waiting for inevitable defeat that could be delayed but not prevented. Kursk represented the moment when that transition from aggressor to defender became irreversible, when German military dominance gave way to Soviet ascendancy, and when the Red Army proved that it had learned not merely to survive German assault, but to defeat it decisively through superior planning, preparation, and coordination of forces at every level of warfare. The summer of 1943 finds the German army in a condition that Hitler will not acknowledge and his generals cannot escape. They are losing. The victory at Kursk, which was supposed to restore German initiative on the Eastern Front, has instead accelerated the Wehrmacht's decline. Soviet armor has absorbed the German assault. Soviet reserves have proven limitless, and German losses cannot be replaced. What follows is not a collapse. The German soldier remained formidable until the final days of the war, but rather a slow, grinding, inexorable retreat that will last until Soviet tanks roll through the smoking streets of Berlin. This is the story of how the master becomes the fugitive, how tactical skill becomes insufficient against strategic exhaustion, and how a year of fighting withdrawal transforms military defeat into national catastrophe. In the aftermath of Kursk, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov launches a coordinated offensive strategy that bears little resemblance to the chaotic human wave assaults of earlier years. The Red Army has learned from experience, and its learning curve has become terrifyingly steep. Soviet commanders now understand combined arms warfare, the coordination of armor, mechanized infantry, artillery, and air power in sequences timed to overwhelm German defenses. Where once Soviet offensives crashed against German lines in desperate frontal attacks, they now flow around German positions, seeking weakness, exploiting gaps, and encircling strong points. The Wehrmacht faces an enemy that has transformed itself from a wounded giant thrashing about into a disciplined fighting force of unprecedented sophistication and scale. Against this rising tide, Germany's capacity to resist has begun to ebb. The retreat from Kursk begins almost immediately. Rather than consolidate around conquered territory, German forces must pull back to prepared defensive lines further west. The distances involved are vast, hundreds of kilometers across steppes and forests where supply lines stretch thinner with every mile surrendered. German logistics officers face a nightmare of coordination. They must withdraw supplies, evacuate wounded, destroy infrastructure that cannot be moved, and maintain order among troops who can feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Soviet columns pursue relentlessly, not content to allow German forces time to organize. The contrast with the summer of 1941 is absolute and psychologically devastating. Then, German panzer spearheads had carved through Soviet defenses at will. Now, German formations must cling to ground inch by inch, defending positions they know they cannot hold indefinitely, trading space for time they hope will arrive but never does. By the autumn of 1943, the focus of the campaign shifts southward to the Donets Basin and toward the Dnieper River, a massive water barrier that Soviet forces are racing to cross before German defenders can establish a foothold on the western bank. The Dnieper runs for more than 1,000 kilometers, a formidable obstacle that German commanders had counted upon to stabilize their front. But the Soviet offensive is executed with such speed and precision that German forces struggle to reach the river before Soviet advance units. When Soviet mechanized columns do begin river crossings, they encounter German units that are tired, depleted, and unable to mount sustained counteroffensives. German divisions that once numbered more than 15,000 combat troops are now operating at half or less than half strength. The replacements promised by German high command arrive sporadically, often inadequately trained, sent to the front as soon as they disembark from trains. The Wehrmacht, the master of maneuver warfare, has become a force fighting for survival. The crossing of the Dnieper by Soviet forces in the autumn of 1943 marks another psychological threshold in the campaign. For the first time in the war, the Soviet army successfully establishes and expands a major bridgehead against German opposition on a barrier of this magnitude. German counterattacks, executed with the same precision and audacity that characterized earlier campaigns, fail to dislodge the Soviet foothold. More Soviet forces pour across the river, and German attempts to bottle up the bridgehead exhaust reserves without result. Soviet engineers construct pontoon bridges under fire, and Soviet logistics personnel somehow supply forces across a river in winter conditions under constant German attack. German officers who participated in earlier triumphs shake their heads in disbelief. The enemy that seemed incompetent has become competent. The Soviet state, which appeared near collapse in the summer of 1941, has instead mobilized resources that dwarf German production. The scales have tipped, and everyone on the front line senses it. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, German forces conduct what military historians call trading space for time, a euphemism for slow, costly retreat. In reality, the process is far more brutal and desperate. German commanders must decide which terrain to defend and which to abandon, knowing that every square kilometer surrendered carries political and economic costs. Ukrainian and Russian territories are not empty ground to German strategic planners. They represent grain reserves, industrial capacity, and manpower. But more immediately, they represent positions that German soldiers must die to hold or die to abandon. The mathematics of attrition favor the Soviet Union overwhelmingly. German casualties, killed, wounded, missing, are being replaced at declining rates, while Soviet reserves, though also suffering staggering losses, are replenished from a population that still numbers more than 190 million people. German officers begin to understand that they are not fighting to win anymore. They are fighting to survive, and perhaps to delay the inevitable long enough that some miraculous political settlement might emerge. It does not. Instead, Soviet offensives pile upon one another through the winter and spring of 1944. Operation Kutuzov in August 1943 liberates Soviet territories around Smolensk. Subsequent offensives in the winter months push German forces out of the Donets Basin, drive Soviet spearheads toward the Carpathian Mountains, and threaten to cut off German Army Group South from supply routes. German commanders beg Hitler for permission to conduct strategic withdrawals, to consolidate forces on shorter, more defensible lines. Hitler, in his East Prussian headquarters, refuses. He orders his generals to stand fast, to defend every position, to accept no retreat. The Führer's strategic directives, once the expressions of genuine military genius, have become the orders of a man divorced from reality. German generals, trapped between military logic and Hitler's commands, must find ways to retreat while appearing to obey orders to stand. It becomes a grotesque game of semantics and deception, where fighting withdrawals are described as tactical repositionings and abandoned territory becomes temporarily ceded ground. The winter of 1943 and 1944 brings new horrors. German soldiers, who have grown to dread the Russian winter since 1941, must now endure it while retreating. Frozen ground means that field fortifications cannot be dug. Supply lines, already strained, become even more fragile in snow and ice. Soviet offensives continue regardless of weather. The Red Army has learned to fight in conditions that paralyze German mobility. German soldiers, issued inadequate winter clothing, develop frostbite and pneumonia at alarming rates. Medical facilities, themselves retreating, cannot handle the volume of casualties. Wounded men must be abandoned or euthanized rather than left to capture. German divisions report that they are losing as many soldiers to cold and disease as to enemy action. The Wehrmacht, the instrument of German conquest, is being ground down not just by the enemy, but by the very land and climate that Germany is abandoning. Every retreat takes German forces away from the sparse supplies that might sustain them and toward the long, frozen roads of Eastern Europe. By the spring of 1944, German forces have abandoned most of the territory they conquered in 1941 and 1942. The vast industrial zones around the Donetsk basin, which German planners had counted upon to replenish German rearmament, are lost. Soviet scorched earth policies have ensured that little of value remains for the Germans anyway. Agricultural regions that were supposed to feed the Wehrmacht instead feed Soviet civilians and Soviet armies. The economic calculus that drove Hitler to launch Barbarossa in the first place has been completely inverted. Instead of extracting resources from conquered territories, Germany is pouring resources into a war it cannot win in order to slow an enemy it cannot defeat. German factories work at unprecedented capacity, and German civilians face mounting deprivation as resources are diverted to the Eastern Front. The home front, far from being strengthened by conquest, is being starved to feed an endless war. The psychological impact on German soldiers cannot be overstated. Men who entered the Soviet Union believing that they would crush Bolshevism in a matter of months, who cheered as German spearheads drove deeper into Soviet territory, who saw themselves as warriors bringing civilization to barbarous lands. These men now find themselves retreating, watching comrades die for territory that will be abandoned anyway, knowing that each new position is simply another place to die while waiting for the inevitable end. The concept of blitzkrieg, of rapid maneuver and quick victory, has given way to something far more primitive and terrifying: trench warfare in the mud and snow, grinding attrition that measures progress in meters and costs in lives. Unit cohesion, which was the hallmark of the Wehrmacht's superiority, begins to fray. Soldiers become cynical, questioning orders, wondering aloud why they are dying for positions that mean nothing. Officers struggle to maintain discipline among men who understand that they are locked in a war that cannot be won. The retreat also reveals the true nature of the occupation regime that Germany has maintained in conquered Soviet territories. As German forces withdraw, they implement scorched earth policies designed to deny resources to the Soviet enemy. But these policies also devastate the civilian populations of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. German soldiers, following orders, burn villages, poison wells, and destroy food stores. Soviet civilians, finding themselves liberated by the Red Army, only to be told that their homes and fields have been destroyed by the retreating Germans, face a bitter winter and a desperate spring. The Nazi regime, in its death throes in the East, exacts a final price from the peoples it conquered. The retreat, far from being a dignified withdrawal, becomes a harvest of scorched earth and human suffering. German officers will later claim that they maintained discipline and civility during the retreat. The record suggests otherwise. Soviet casualties during this period of relentless offensive warfare are staggering. The Red Army drives westward at enormous cost, bleeding in assaults that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. But Soviet commanders, aware of their numerical superiority and confident in their strategic advantage, are willing to accept casualties that would have destroyed German morale in 1941. Soviet soldiers, fighting on their own soil, understanding that the war is being won, accept losses with a grim determination. Soviet generals have learned that continuous pressure, relentless momentum, and the willingness to absorb casualties are the keys to breaking German resistance. Where German operations were characterized by precision and minimum casualties, Soviet operations are characterized by sheer, overwhelming force applied with increasing sophistication. The result is that Soviet armies, for all their losses, emerge from the retreat period actually stronger, better equipped, more confident than before. The Red Army is no longer the desperate, improvised force of 1941. It is the master of the battlefield. As 1944 dawns, German forces occupy a line that runs roughly from the Baltic coast south, through eastern Poland and into the Carpathians. It is the best defensive position available, but it is also a line drawn across German Lebensraum, the territory that Hitler had sworn to conquer and hold. More ominously, it is a line that is still being pushed backward by Soviet offensives. German commanders understand that the war on the Eastern Front is essentially lost. The only question remaining is how long it will take for the final collapse, and how much more blood must be spilled before the inevitable conclusion is reached. Hitler, however, continues to issue orders for offensive operations that do not exist except in his imagination. German generals, bearing the weight of command, must somehow maintain an army in being, preserve the lives of their men, and prevent complete dissolution while obeying the orders of a supreme commander whose grip on reality has become ever more tenuous. The retreat continues into spring, the spring into summer, and by midsummer, Operation Barbarossa will deliver a final catastrophe that will shatter German Army Group Center and prove, beyond any possible doubt, that the master of 1941 has become the victim of 1944. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941, he believed the conquest of Soviet territory would solve Germany's most pressing crisis, the catastrophic shortage of resources strangling his war machine. The German economy, already stretched to breaking point by years of rearmament, could not sustain prolonged war without access to vast supplies of grain, oil, iron ore, and other raw materials that only Eastern Europe possessed. Hitler's generals assured him that destroying the Soviet Union would take mere months, perhaps weeks, and that the conquered lands would feed the German people while supplying the Wehrmacht with everything required to dominate Europe indefinitely. This promise formed the core of Barbarossa's logic. Without victory in the East, without the resources that victory promised, Germany faced slow strangulation through resource depletion and economic exhaustion. Yet by 1944, nearly 3 years into the campaign, Hitler's promise had transformed into catastrophe. The swift victory never came. The resources never materialized. And Germany, instead of achieving abundance through conquest, descended into deepening privation that corroded both military capability and civilian morale. The failure of Barbarossa to deliver resources revealed a brutal miscalculation at the heart of Hitler's strategy. German planners had assumed that Soviet territory would fall largely intact, that railroads and infrastructure would prove usable, and that German occupation would smoothly extract the wealth and foodstuffs necessary to sustain the Reich. This assumption ignored the reality of Soviet determination to deny resources to the invader. As German forces advanced across Western Russia and Ukraine, Soviet troops and civilians implemented systematic scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure, burning crops, poisoning wells, and carrying off machinery rather than allow it to fall into German hands. The Soviet Union possessed neither the luxury nor the inclination to preserve resources for their conquerors. Every grain store burned, every factory demolished, every rail line sabotaged meant that German planners' calculations collapsed into ruins as surely as the cities they occupied. By 1942, it became apparent that conquered Soviet territory would not feed the Wehrmacht or the Reich. Instead, these lands required enormous resources simply to administer and garrison, diverting supplies away from other theaters and away from the home front. The promise of conquest became a drain of unimaginable proportions. Agricultural shortages struck Germany with particular ferocity as the war in the East dragged into its third and fourth years. Germany had always been dependent on food imports, purchasing grain from Eastern European suppliers and relying on controlled trade agreements to sustain its population. Barbarossa promised to eliminate this dependency by annexing the Soviet grain lands of Ukraine, turning Germany's weakest flank into its greatest source of strength. Yet occupied Soviet agriculture collapsed under the weight of war, occupation, and German requisition policies that treated conquered lands as mere extraction zones rather than territories requiring investment and management. Soviet peasants, conscripted or forced to work under German supervision, lacked the incentive to maximize production for their occupiers. The vast stretches of land that had once fed millions became devastated zones where harvests fell catastrophically short of expectations. By 1943, German planners faced the grim reality that instead of feeding the Reich, the conquered eastern territories required food shipments from Germany itself, creating a vicious cycle where the occupying power sacrificed supplies at home to prevent starvation among conquered populations and occupation forces. Rationing in Germany, which had always been restrictive, tightened further as each month passed without victory in the East. The fuel shortage proved equally crippling and ultimately more decisive than food scarcity. Barbarossa's original objective included the seizure of the Caucasus oil fields, sources of petroleum that seemed essential for sustaining Germany's mechanized warfare. Hitler's obsession with reaching these fields drove the 1942 offensives in southern Russia, consuming enormous resources and manpower in an attempt to capture oil resources that always remained just beyond German grasp. When the Wehrmacht failed to reach the Caucasus, when Soviet forces held the oil fields just beyond German reach, the entire strategic premise of the campaign collapsed. Germany possessed no significant domestic oil sources beyond meager synthetics production. Without Soviet oil, the Reich depended entirely on captured Romanian supplies and whatever fuel could be synthesized through industrial processes consuming coal and electricity. As the war extended into 1943 and 1944, fuel shortages became so severe that the Luftwaffe could not mount the sorties necessary to defend German airspace against increasing Allied bombing. Panzer divisions operating on reduced fuel rations could not conduct the rapid maneuvers that had made German mechanized warfare legendary. The Navy could not operate effectively. Fuel shortages did not merely constrain military operations, they paralyzed the entire German war effort, converting a mechanized force into one increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport and static defense. Shortages of raw materials compounded these calamities with relentless intensity. Germany required immense quantities of iron ore, copper, chromium, tungsten, and other strategic materials to sustain its manufacturing base. Before Barbarossa, these supplies came through complex trade networks and captured stocks from conquered territories. As the war extended beyond the swift victory Hitler had promised, these sources proved inadequate. Soviet scorched earth tactics denied Germany access to valuable deposits. Extended supply lines across primitive Soviet roads meant that materials which did reach German territory often arrived in insufficient quantities or severely delayed. Manufacturing became increasingly difficult. Ammunition production fell short of requirements. Tank production, while maintaining respectable numbers through 1944, consumed resources at a rate that could never be sustained. Aircraft production rose, but consumed materials that should have been devoted to other military needs. The German economy, structured around the assumption of swift conquest and resource abundance, instead faced the nightmare scenario of prolonged war with shrinking supplies and mounting demands. The extended logistics network stretching from Germany across Eastern Europe to the fighting front became a catastrophic vulnerability rather than a lifeline. German quartermasters, lacking adequate motor vehicles and forced to rely on horse-drawn transport and captured Soviet rail stock, struggled desperately to maintain supply lines across distances that had only grown longer as the front moved deeper into Soviet territory. The railroads of Eastern Europe operated on different gauge systems than German railways, requiring constant conversion and transfer of cargo that consumed precious time and resources. Primitive roads that became mud during spring and autumn rains paralyzed transport for weeks at a time. Soviet partisan activity, growing more coordinated and effective as the war continued, attacked supply columns and cut rail lines with increasing frequency, forcing Germans to divert combat troops to security duties rather than frontline operations. Each truck, each rail car sent eastward fed the front but starved civilian economy and domestic manufacturing. Germany found itself locked in a grinding war of attrition that its logistics network could not support, yet could not abandon without admitting defeat. By 1944, the German home front faced shortages that eroded both military production and civilian morale with accelerating speed. Food rationing reached levels that, while rarely causing outright starvation, except among slave laborers and prisoners, created a pervasive sense of deprivation and hunger among the civilian population. Bread rations declined, meat became scarce, vegetables, fruits, and fats appeared infrequently on German tables. The promised bounty of conquered eastern lands became a hollow fantasy that every German could see through the austere reality of their own empty larders. Black market trading flourished as those with access to scarce goods exploited desperate consumers. Morale deteriorated as German civilians observed that their sacrifices produced no visible improvement in the military situation, no sense that final victory drew closer. Women bore the heaviest burden, attempting to feed families on inadequate rations while working in factories and managing households depleted of resources and male inhabitants. The contrast between Nazi propaganda promises of triumph and the grim reality of shortages and defeat created a credibility gap that grew wider with each passing month. Bombing attacks on German cities added a new and devastating dimension to civilian suffering. As the war continued, American and British bombing campaigns intensified, targeting German industrial capacity, rail networks, and cities themselves. German cities, previously safe from enemy attack, now endured nights of terror as bombers dropped incendiary and high-explosive munitions. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Dresden, and dozens of other cities experienced catastrophic bombing raids that killed tens of thousands and left hundreds of thousands homeless. Families lost homes, possessions, and loved ones. Refugees fleeing bombed cities created humanitarian crises in regions already struggling with shortages. The burden of reconstruction and relief fell on civil authorities already stretched to the limit by military demands. Power plants damaged in bombing raids reduced the electrical supply available for manufacturing, deepening the resource crisis. Water systems disrupted by bombing created sanitation problems. The ability of German industry to sustain the war effort further declined as factories burned and skilled workers were killed or conscripted. The bombing campaign, while not causing German surrender by itself, compounds the effects of failed Barbarossa, transforming the home front into a place of mounting despair. The Nazi regime's response to these mounting pressures revealed the totalitarian essence of the system and its fundamental incompatibility with honest communication about Germany's true situation. Rather than acknowledge the failure of Barbarossa or prepare the civilian population for realistic outcomes, Nazi authorities intensified propaganda, promising final victory while conditions objectively worsened. Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels deployed increasingly extravagant claims about secret weapons soon to be deployed, about the imminent collapse of Allied unity, about German resourcefulness overcoming any shortage. These lies, transparent to much of the population, further eroded credibility and morale.